Beneath the restless waters of the Mediterranean, where silver moonlight dances on gentle waves, lies a silence deeper than memory itself. Here, where the mighty Nile once kissed the endless sea, stone columns rest in perpetual twilight, their carved faces turned toward a sun they will never again behold. Ancient streets, once alive with the footsteps of merchants and pilgrims, now cradle only the soft whispers of currents and the delicate ballet of fish swimming through doorways that once welcomed the world. In this underwater cathedral of time, where temple bells have been replaced by the distant song of whales, the lost city of Thonis-Heracleion sleeps its eternal dream, waiting for voices to remember what the depths have preserved. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. In the beginning, there was only the meeting of waters. The great Nile, mother of all Egyptian civilization, flowed northward with the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 miles, carrying within her muddy embrace the fertile secrets of the heart of Africa. As she approached the Mediterranean Sea, her waters began to slow, spreading wide across the delta like fingers of a gentle hand reaching toward the horizon. Here, in this sacred confluence where river met sea, the ancient Egyptians recognized something profound, a place where the terrestrial and celestial realms touched, where the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the gods became thin as morning mist. The city that would become known as Thonis to the Egyptians and Heracleion to the Greeks did not spring forth fully formed from the imagination of some ancient architect. Rather, it emerged slowly, organically, like a lotus flower unfurling its petals in the first light of dawn. The earliest settlers, drawn by the abundance of fish in these waters and the strategic advantage of controlling the mouth of the Nile, began constructing their humble dwellings on what they believed to be solid ground. They could not have known that beneath their feet lay not bedrock, but a foundation of silt and clay, accumulated over millennia by the river's patient deposits. Archaeological evidence painstakingly recovered from the Mediterranean's depths tells us that the first permanent settlements in this region date back to at least the 8th century BCE, though the area likely held religious significance for centuries before that. The location was not chosen randomly. It occupied the canopic mouth of the Nile, one of the river's most important branches, serving as Egypt's primary gateway to the Mediterranean world. From this vantage point, ancient harbour master could observe approaching vessels while there were still distant specks on the horizon, ensuring that Egypt's borders remained secure while facilitating the commerce that would make the city one of the wealthiest in the ancient world. The name Thonis itself carries within it the echoes of ancient Egyptian religious practice. It derives from the Egyptian word tahent, meaning the place of the divine flood, a reference to the annual inundation of the Nile that brought life to the land. Each year, when the river rose and merged with the sea in a spectacular display of natural power, the boundaries between Thonis and the surrounding landscape would blur, transforming the city into a kind of sacred island, connected to the mainland by a network of canals and bridges that seemed to float upon the water's surface. But the city held meaning beyond its Egyptian identity. To the Greeks, who would come to know it as Heracleion, this settlement represented something equally profound, a connection to their own mythological hero, Heracles. According to Greek legend, it was here that Heracles first set foot on Egyptian soil, and it was here that he was welcomed by the goddess Isis herself. The Greeks, master storytellers that they were, wove elaborate tales of how Heracles had performed great deeds in this very harbour, how he had lifted massive stones to create the port's foundations, and how he had blessed the city with his divine protection. The convergence of these two cultural identities, Egyptian and Greek, was not merely symbolic but practical. As trade between the Mediterranean world and the Egyptian heartland intensified, Thonis-Heracleion became a crucial point of cultural exchange. Egyptian merchants learned to speak Greek, while Greek traders adopted Egyptian customs. The city's temples hosted priests who could conduct ceremonies in both traditions, and its markets offered goods from the length and breadth of the known world. The physical layout of early Thonis-Heracleion reflected this dual identity. The city was built on a series of interconnected islands, linked by bridges and traversed by an intricate network of canals. The main harbour, protected by massive stone breakwaters, could accommodate hundreds of vessels simultaneously. Along the waterfront, warehouses and administrative buildings stood ready to process the endless flow of goods and people. Behind them, residential districts climbed gently inland, their streets lined with workshops, taverns, and smaller temples dedicated to the myriad deities who watched over travellers and merchants. The harbour itself was a marvel of ancient engineering. Its designers had taken advantage of the natural contours of the seafloor, dredging channels where necessary and reinforcing the shoreline with massive stone blocks. A series of lighthouses, their fires visible for miles across the water, guided ships safely into port even during the darkest nights. The main lighthouse, dedicated to Khonsu, the Egyptian god of the moon, stood over 60 feet tall, its beacon reflecting off the waters like a terrestrial star. Within the city proper, the most impressive structures were undoubtedly the temples. The great temple of Amun, the king of the Egyptian gods, dominated the city's skyline with its towering columns and golden capstone that caught the first rays of each morning's sun. Nearby, the Temple of Khonsu provided a counterpoint, its silver decorations gleaming in the moonlight. These were not merely places of worship, but centres of economic and political power, their priest administrators wielding influence that extended far beyond the city's borders. The geography of Thonis-Heracleion was its destiny. Positioned at the precise point where the canopic branch of the Nile met the Mediterranean Sea, the city controlled one of the most strategically important waterways in the ancient world. This location brought tremendous advantages, but it also carried within it the seeds of the city's eventual destruction. The same forces that made Thonis-Heracleion wealthy and powerful, the constant flow of water, the soft sedimentary foundation, the intersection of tidal and riverine forces, would ultimately prove to be its undoing. The Nile Delta, that vast fan of fertile land spreading northward from Memphis to the sea, was and remains one of the most dynamic geographical features on Earth. Each year, the river's flood carried countless tons of silt downstream, depositing it in layers that built up the delta's foundation grain by grain. This process, repeated annually for thousands of years, created land so rich and productive that it could support one of history's greatest civilizations. But it also created a foundation that was far from stable. The citizens of Thonis-Heracleion lived their daily lives atop this shifting foundation, largely unaware of the gradual changes occurring beneath their feet. The silt deposits that accumulated year after year were not uniform. Some areas received more sediment than others, creating an uneven subsurface that would slowly compact and settle under the weight of the city's buildings. Engineers and architects of the time, skilled though they were, could not have anticipated the long-term consequences of building a major urban centre on such unstable ground. The city's harbours required constant maintenance to remain navigable. Teams of workers, many of them slaves captured in Egypt's various military campaigns, laboured continuously to dredge channels and clear away the silt that threatened to fill them. The harbour master, a position of considerable importance in the city's hierarchy, oversaw these operations with meticulous care. Records carved into stone tablets, recovered from the underwater ruins, detail the challenges these ancient engineers faced. Shifting sandbars that could ground ships, channels that needed to be deepened seasonally, and the constant battle against the natural tendency of the delta to fill in any artificial waterway. The seasonal rhythm of the Nile flood shaped every aspect of life in Thonis-Heracleion. Each summer, as the river rose with the melting snow and seasonal rains of the Ethiopian highlands, the city would transform. Water levels that had been carefully managed during the dry season would surge, turning streets into canals and transforming the city into a vast archipelago. Far from being a hardship, this annual transformation was celebrated as a sign of the gods' favour. The flood brought not only water but also the rich silt that would fertilise crops and the promise of another year of prosperity. During flood season, the city's population would swell dramatically. Farmers from throughout the delta region would bring their families to town, seeking shelter on higher ground while their fields lay under water. Merchants would arrive with goods that could only be transported during the high water season, taking advantage of the temporary navigability of normally shallow channels. The city's temples would host elaborate festivals celebrating the flood's arrival, with ceremonies that drew pilgrims from across Egypt and beyond. The religious significance of Thonis-Heracleion's location cannot be overstated. In ancient Egyptian cosmology, the intersection of the Nile and the sea represented far more than a geographical feature. It was a sacred boundary between the ordered world of Egypt and the chaotic realm of foreign lands. The city served as a kind of spiritual customs house, where foreign visitors would undergo purification rituals before being permitted to travel further into the Egyptian heartland. These ceremonies, conducted by priests trained in both Egyptian and foreign traditions, ensured that the purity of Egypt's sacred landscape would not be compromised by contact with the outside world. The Temple of Amun, the city's most important religious structure, was specifically positioned to take advantage of this sacred geography. Built on the highest point of the main island, it commanded views both upriver into the Egyptian heartland and out to sea toward the foreign lands beyond. The temple's orientation was precisely calculated so that on certain days of the year, the rising sun would illuminate the inner sanctuary in a display that was said to represent the gods' approval of Egypt's dominance over both land and sea. Trade routes converged on Thonis-Heracleion from every direction. From the south came goods from the heart of Africa, gold from Nubia, ivory from the upper reaches of the Nile, exotic animals for the Pharaohs' menageries, and slaves to work in Egypt's quarries and construction projects. From the east arrived spices and incense from Arabia, precious stones from India, and silk from the distant lands of China. From the west came olive oil and wine from Libya, and from the north, the manufactured goods of the Greek world, pottery, metalwork, and the philosophical and artistic innovations that would profoundly influence Egyptian culture. The city's merchants, many of whom came from families that had been involved in trade for generations, developed sophisticated systems for managing this complex flow of goods. Warehouses were specialized by commodity, with separate facilities for grain, wine, oil, metals, and luxury goods. A complex system of weights and measures, overseen by government officials, ensured fair trading practices. Records were meticulously maintained, carved into stone or written on papyrus, documenting every transaction and providing the information needed to collect the taxes that funded the city's operations. The harbour district pulsed with activity from dawn to dusk. Stevedores, their bodies bronzed by the sun and hardened by years of labour, loaded and unloaded ships with practised efficiency. Ship captains, many of them veterans of dozens of voyages, negotiated with merchants and harbour officials in a polyglot mixture of Egyptian, Greek, and various other languages. The air was filled with the sounds of creaking timber, shouting voices, and the splash of cargo being transferred from ship to shore. In the heart of Thonis-Heracleion, where the morning sun painted the limestone walls of the great temple, in shades of gold and amber, the sacred and the commercial existed in perfect harmony. This was not merely a port city but a spiritual gateway, where the divine authority of the pharaoh met the practical needs of international trade. The harbour that welcomed merchants from across the known world was also a sacred space, blessed by ceremonies that had been performed without interruption for centuries. The great temple of Amun stood as the city's spiritual centre, its massive columns rising from the harbour front like the legs of a giant striding across the water. These columns, each one carved from a single piece of red granite quarried in distant Aswan, had been transported down the Nile on barges specially constructed for the purpose. The temple's construction had taken decades, requiring the coordinated efforts of thousands of workers, stonemasons who shape the blocks with precision that still amazes modern engineers, artists who carve the intricate hieroglyphs that covered every surface, and priests who ensured that each element of the design conformed to the sacred principles of Egyptian religious architecture. The temple's most sacred space was the inner sanctuary, where a golden statue of Amun, king of the gods, resided in perpetual twilight. This statue, crafted by the finest artisans in Egypt and adorned with precious stones from the farthest reaches of the known world, was said to house the god's living essence. Only the high priest and the pharaoh himself were permitted to enter this holy of holies, and then only after elaborate purification rituals that could take days to complete. The daily rhythm of temple life began before dawn, when the first priests would arrive to prepare for the morning ceremonies. These men, chosen for their learning and devotion, had spent years studying the complex rituals required to maintain the god's favour. They would wash themselves in the sacred pools fed by channels from the Nile, don their ceremonial white linen robes, and begin the intricate process of awakening the god for another day. The statue would be bathed, dressed in fresh clothing, and presented with offerings of food and drink, all while the priests chanted prayers that had been passed down through generations. The temple complex extended far beyond the main sanctuary. A series of courtyards, each one larger than the last, led from the inner sanctum to the harbour front. These spaces served multiple purposes. They provided areas for public ceremonies, housed the temple's administrative offices, and served as workshops where skilled artisans produced the religious objects needed for the temple's operations. The outermost courtyard, paved with polished limestone and surrounded by a colonnade of smaller, but still impressive columns, was where ordinary citizens could come to pray and make offerings. Adjacent to the great temple stood the temple of Khonsu, dedicated to the god of the moon and the son of Amun. This structure, while smaller than its neighbour, was no less impressive in its own way. Its silver-leafed dome could be seen from ships approaching the harbour, serving as both a navigational landmark and a symbol of the city's divine protection. The Temple of Khonsu was particularly important to sailors and merchants, who would come to seek the god's blessing before embarking on dangerous voyages. The priestly hierarchy of Thonis-Heracleion was complex and highly structured. At the apex stood the high priest of Amun, a position that carried not only religious authority, but also significant political power. This individual, always chosen from the most prominent families in Egyptian society, served as the pharaoh's representative in the city and wielded influence that extended far beyond religious matters. Below him were the various orders of priests, each with specific responsibilities. Some maintained the temple buildings, others conducted the daily rituals, and still others served as scribes and administrators. The temple's economic influence was enormous. In addition to receiving offerings from worshippers, the temples owned vast tracts of agricultural land throughout the Delta region. These holdings, worked by teams of tenant farmers, produced grain, vegetables, and other foodstuffs that fed the temple's staff and supported its operations. The temples also maintained workshops where skilled craftsmen produced goods that were sold in the city's markets, generating additional income that was used to fund construction projects and maintain the elaborate ceremonies that were central to Egyptian religious life. For foreign visitors arriving in Thonis-Heracleion, the temple served an important practical function as well as a spiritual one. Before merchants could proceed into the Egyptian heartland, they were required to undergo purification rituals designed to ensure that they would not bring any foreign contamination into the sacred land of Egypt. These ceremonies, conducted by priests who had studied foreign customs and languages, could take several days to complete. During this time, the visitors would be housed in special quarters within the temple complex, where they would be fed, clothed, and instructed in the basic principles of Egyptian religious practice. The purification process was both elaborate and symbolic. Foreign visitors would first be required to bathe in pools filled with water from the Nile, symbolically washing away the pollution of foreign lands. They would then be dressed in simple white linen garments, abandoning their foreign clothing for the duration of their stay in Egypt. Priests would examine their possessions, blessing those that were deemed acceptable and confiscating those that might carry spiritual contamination. Finally, the visitors would participate in ceremonies designed to place them under the protection of Egyptian gods, ensuring their safe passage through the sacred landscape. The harbour itself was considered sacred space, blessed by elaborate ceremonies that were performed at regular intervals. These rituals, designed to ensure the continued favour of the gods who controlled the winds and waters, involved the participation of the entire community. Priests would board specially decorated barges and sail them around the harbour's perimeter, sprinkling sacred water and incense while chanting prayers for the safety of all who used the port. The ceremony would conclude with the sacrifice of bulls, whose blood would be mixed with Nile water and poured into the harbour to ensure the gods' continued protection. The religious calendar of Thonis-Heracleion was filled with festivals and ceremonies that drew participants from across Egypt and beyond. The most important of these was the annual festival of the sacred marriage, a celebration that commemorated the union between Amun and his consort, Mut. This elaborate ceremony, lasting for several days, involved processions, theatrical performances, and ritual banquets that brought together people from all levels of society. The festival culminated in a ceremony where the statues of the two deities were brought together in a symbolic marriage that was said to ensure the continued fertility of the land. The city's role as a religious centre was closely tied to its function as a commercial hub. The temple's need for exotic materials for their ceremonies created a market for goods from distant lands: frankincense from Arabia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon, and gold from Nubia. Merchants who specialized in these religious commodities often became wealthy and influential, using their profits to fund the construction of private chapels and tombs that rivaled those of the nobility. The streets of Thonis-Heracleion hummed with languages from across the known world. In the markets that sprawled behind the harbour front, Egyptian merchants bargained with Greek traders in voices that carried the musical cadences of their respective tongues. Nubian gold dealers, their dark skin gleaming with perspiration in the Mediterranean sun, negotiated with pale-skinned Phoenicians who had sailed westward from the cities of the Levant. The air was thick with the scent of exotic spices, the sound of hammering from metalworkers' shops, and the constant murmur of commercial activity that never seemed to cease. The city's population was as diverse as its commercial offerings. Permanent residents included not only native Egyptians, but also communities of foreign merchants who had settled in the city to take advantage of its strategic location. These immigrants brought their own customs and traditions, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that was unusual for ancient Egypt. Greek philosophers could be found debating in the city's academies, while Arabian astronomers taught their skills to Egyptian students. Jewish traders, part of the diaspora that had begun centuries earlier, maintained their own quarter of the city, complete with a synagogue and schools where their children learned Hebrew alongside Egyptian and Greek. The merchant classes of Thonis-Heracleion were organized into guilds that regulated trade practices and maintained standards of quality. The Guild of Grain Merchants, one of the most powerful, controlled the export of Egypt's agricultural surplus to hungry populations throughout the Mediterranean world. These men, many of whom had inherited their positions from fathers and grandfathers who'd been in the trade for generations, possessed an intimate knowledge of market conditions throughout the region. They could predict with remarkable accuracy when harvests would be good or bad, when demand would be high or low, and how to time their shipments to maximize profits. The spice merchants formed another powerful guild, their warehouses filled with aromatic treasures from the distant east. Cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, and saffron from the Persian highlands arrived in Thonis-Heracleion on ships that had braved pirates, storms, and the countless other hazards of long-distance trade. These merchants, who often spoke half a dozen languages fluently, served as intermediaries between the producers of these exotic goods and the consumers who were willing to pay premium prices for the flavors that would enhance their food and the scents that would perfume their homes. The luxury goods trade was perhaps the most glamorous aspect of the city's commercial life. Merchants who dealt in precious stones, fine textiles, and artistic objects often became wealthy enough to rival the nobility in their lifestyle. Their shops, located in the most prestigious districts of the city, were showplaces where the wealthy would come to browse among treasures that had been collected from the far corners of the earth. Silk from China, worked into garments of extraordinary beauty, hung alongside carpets from Persia, and jewellery crafted by the finest artisans of the ancient world. These slaves who provided much of the labour for the city's commercial operations came from many different backgrounds. Some were prisoners of war captured during Egypt's military campaigns in Nubia, Libya, or the Levant. Others were people who'd been sold into slavery to pay debts or as punishment for crimes. Still others were the descendants of slaves, born into bondage but often skilled in trades that made them valuable to their owners. The slave markets of Thonis-Heracleion were notorious throughout the ancient world, not for their cruelty, but for the high quality of the human merchandise they offered. The city's harbour was designed to accommodate the needs of international commerce. Different sections of the port were designated for different types of cargo. One area for grain ships, another for vessels carrying luxury goods, and a third for the military vessels that protected Egypt's commercial interests. The harbour master, a position appointed by the pharaoh himself, oversaw all of these operations with the help of a large staff of clerks, inspectors, and dock workers. Every ship that entered the harbour was required to register its cargo and pay the appropriate taxes, generating revenue that helped fund the city's operations. The process of loading and unloading ships was carefully orchestrated to minimize delays and ensure that cargo was handled safely. Teams of stevedores, many of them slaves supervised by free workers, used sophisticated systems of pulleys and ramps to move heavy cargo from ship to shore. The largest ships, which could carry hundreds of tons of goods, required several days to unload completely. During this time, the crew would often take shore leave, contributing to the city's economy by spending their wages in taverns, brothels, and markets. The city's reputation as a centre of learning attracted scholars and students from across the Mediterranean world. The library of Thonis-Heracleion, while smaller than its famous counterpart in Alexandria, nonetheless housed an impressive collection of texts in multiple languages. Egyptian scribes worked alongside Greek scholars to translate important works, making knowledge available to a broader audience. The medical school, associated with the Temple of Imhotep, trained physicians who would practice throughout the Egyptian Empire and beyond. Religious pilgrims formed another important category of visitors to Thonis-Heracleion. The city's temples, particularly the Great Temple of Amun, attracted devotees from throughout the Egyptian world. These pilgrims, who came seeking healing, guidance, or simply to fulfill religious obligations, provided a steady source of income for the city's innkeepers, guides, and vendors of religious artifacts. The pilgrimage trade was so important that the city maintained special facilities to accommodate the needs of these visitors, including hostels where they could stay, and markets where they could purchase the offerings required for temple ceremonies. The seasonal nature of ancient navigation meant that the city's population fluctuated dramatically throughout the year. During the sailing season, which ran roughly from spring to early autumn, the city would be crowded with visitors. Ships would arrive daily, bringing merchants, pilgrims, and travellers of all descriptions. The city's infrastructure was designed to handle these fluctuations, with temporary markets that could be set up quickly and housing that could accommodate the periodic influx of visitors. The winter months, when navigation was dangerous and most ships remained in port, were a time of relative quiet in Thonis-Heracleion. During these periods, the city's permanent residents would focus on maintenance and preparation for the following season. Ships would be repaired, warehouses would be reorganized, and the city's defences would be strengthened. The temples would use this time to perform the elaborate ceremonies that were difficult to conduct when the city was crowded with visitors. The city's legal system was designed to handle the complex disputes that inevitably arose in such a cosmopolitan environment. Courts staffed by judges who were familiar with both Egyptian law and foreign customs would hear cases involving merchants from different countries, disputes over contracts written in multiple languages, and conflicts between people who followed different religious traditions. The city maintained its own prison, where those who violated commercial regulations or disturbed the peace could be held until their cases were resolved. The banking system of Thonis-Heracleion was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Money changers, working from shops located near the harbour, would exchange the various currencies used by international traders. They maintained detailed records of exchange rates and could provide letters of credit that would be honoured by their counterparts in other cities. Some of these financial institutions grew wealthy enough to fund trading expeditions, lending money to merchants who needed capital to purchase goods for export. As the sun set over the harbour each day, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson, the city would gradually quiet down. The last ships of the day would be secured to their moorings, their crews beginning the process of unloading cargo that would continue by torchlight into the night. In the temples, priests would perform the evening ceremonies that would ensure the gods' protection through the hours of darkness. And in the markets and taverns, merchants would gather to share news, plan future ventures, and enjoy the fruits of their labour in this remarkable city, where the ancient world came together in pursuit of profit and spiritual fulfillment. The network of relationships that bound together the merchants, priests and officials of Thonis-Heracleion was complex and constantly evolving. Marriages between merchant families from different countries created alliances that could last for generations. Religious ceremonies brought together people from all levels of society, creating bonds that transcended commercial interests. And the shared experience of living in a city that served as a bridge between different worlds created a unique culture that combined elements from many different traditions while remaining distinctly Egyptian at its core, became the very foundation upon which the greatest maritime empire of the ancient world would flourish. The priests who tended the sacred flames in the temple of Amun spoke in whispers of the city's divine protection, how the god himself had chosen this place, where the waters of the Nile embraced the endless Mediterranean, creating a harbour that would welcome vessels from every corner of the known world. In the pre-dawn hours, when the mist still clung to the water like the breath of sleeping gods, the harbour of Thonis-Heracleion stirred with the gentle rhythm of an ancient ritual. The priests of Amun moved through the sacred precincts with the measured steps of those who served not merely a city, but a divine covenant written in water and stone. Their temple, rising majestically from the harbour's edge, commanded a view that stretched from the fertile delta to the horizon where sea met sky in an endless dance of blue. The great god Amun, known to the Greeks as Heracles, presided over this watery realm with the patience of eternity itself. His temple was not merely a structure of limestone and granite, but a living symbol of the marriage between Egyptian wisdom and foreign influence, between the ancient traditions of the Pharaohs and the restless energy of Mediterranean traders. The massive columns that supported the temple's roof were carved with hieroglyphs that told the story of creation itself, where the primordial waters of Nun had given birth to all existence, and where Thonis-Heracleion now served as the earthly reflection of that cosmic birth. Every morning, as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose, the high priest would climb the steps to the temple's highest sanctuary. There, in a chamber that caught the first light of dawn, he would perform the daily ritual that had sustained the city for over 1,000 years. The sacred bark of Amun, carved from the finest cedar wood and inlaid with gold and precious stones, would be lifted by the temple servants and carried in solemn procession to the water's edge. The god's journey across the harbour waters was not merely ceremony, but a renewal of the divine contract that protected every ship that sought shelter in these sacred waters. The temple complex itself was a marvel that drew pilgrims from across the known world. Built on an island that had been artificially expanded and reinforced over centuries, it rose from the water like a divine mountain, its walls reflecting the changing moods of the harbour. The main temple, dedicated to Amun, was surrounded by smaller shrines to other deities who watched over sailors and merchants. Khnum, the ram-headed god who controlled the Nile's flood, had his place of honour near the temple's southern wall, where the sacred Nilometer measured the river's annual rise and fall. But it was the goddess Neith, the ancient protector of Sais and the patron deity of the Red Crown of Lower Egypt, who held perhaps the most significant place in the religious life of Thonis-Heracleion. Her temple, connected to the main complex by a causeway that disappeared beneath the water at high tide, served as the final checkpoint for all foreign goods entering Egypt. It was here that the sacred tax was collected, not merely as tribute to the pharaoh, but as an offering to the goddess who had blessed Egypt with abundance since the dawn of time. The religious calendar of Thonis-Heracleion was marked by festivals that transformed the entire city into a stage for divine drama. The most magnificent of these was the festival of Amun, held during the month of Khoiak when the Nile reached its lowest ebb and the god's protection was most desperately needed. For 7 days and 7 nights, the harbour blazed with torches and oil lamps, their light dancing on the water like fallen stars. Ships from across the Mediterranean timed their arrivals to coincide with this celebration, knowing that goods blessed during the festival would fetch the highest prices in the markets of Memphis and Thebes. During these festivals, the boundary between the sacred and the secular dissolved like morning mist. Merchants who had travelled for months across dangerous seas would join their voices with those of Egyptian priests in hymns that had been sung in this harbour for 1,000 years. The Greek traders, who had established their own quarter in the city, brought their own traditions to the celebration, creating a unique fusion of religious practices that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. The priests of Thonis-Heracleion were more than religious figures. They were the guardians of ancient wisdom, the keepers of astronomical knowledge that allowed the city to predict the floods, the winds, and the tides with uncanny accuracy. In the temple scriptorium, scribes worked by lamplight to copy and preserve texts that chronicled not only religious rituals, but also the practical knowledge that made the city's prosperity possible. Mathematical calculations for engineering projects, astronomical observations for navigation, medical treatises for treating the diseases that plagued sailors, all of this knowledge was preserved within the temple walls. The temple's influence extended far beyond the confines of the city itself. Pilgrims who came to worship at the shrine of Amun often stayed for months, studying with the priests and learning the secrets of navigation, medicine, and trade. When they returned to their home cities scattered across the Mediterranean, they carried with them not only religious inspiration, but also practical knowledge that would transform their own communities. In this way, Thonis-Heracleion became a centre of learning that rivaled even the Great Library of Alexandria. As the centuries passed and the reputation of Thonis-Heracleion spread across the ancient world, the city entered what would later be remembered as its Golden Age. The harbour, which had once accommodated the simple papyrus boats of local fishermen, now welcomed vessels of extraordinary size and sophistication. Phoenician ships with their distinctive red sails brought cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon, while Greek merchantmen arrived heavy with amphora of wine and olive oil from the islands of the Aegean. The docks of Thonis-Heracleion stretched for miles along the harbour's edge, a testament to the city's prosperity and its crucial role in the ancient world's economy. These were not simple wooden piers, but massive stone constructions that could accommodate ships of up to 50 metres in length. The engineering required to build such structures in the soft delta soil was remarkable, with foundations that extended deep into the riverbed and were reinforced with millions of tons of stone blocks quarried from the distant hills of Upper Egypt. Each section of the harbour was specialised for different types of cargo and different origins. The eastern quays were reserved for the grain ships that carried Egypt's surplus harvest to hungry cities across the Mediterranean. These vessels, some of the largest ever built in the ancient world, could carry up to 1,200 tons of wheat, barley, and other grains in their deep holds. The sight of these massive ships being loaded with the golden treasure of Egypt was one that impressed even the most travelled merchants, a reminder of the agricultural wealth that made Egypt the breadbasket of the ancient world. The western docks welcomed the luxury traders, merchants who dealt in goods so precious that their arrival would be announced by special heralds throughout the city. From the far reaches of the Red Sea came ships laden with frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins that were worth more than their weight in gold. The journey these merchants had undertaken was perilous beyond imagination, crossing the deserts of Arabia and navigating the treacherous waters of the Red Sea before making the overland journey to the Nile and then down the river to Thonis-Heracleion. From the south came the ivory traders, men who had ventured deep into the heart of Africa to bring back the white gold that adorned the palaces of pharaohs and the temples of gods. These merchants would arrive with their precious cargo carefully wrapped in linen and guarded by warriors who'd been paid in advance for their lives if necessary. The ivory trade was not merely about luxury, but about the symbols of power and divinity that could only be carved from the tusks of elephants. Every pharaoh's throne, every sacred statue, every ceremonial object of importance contained ivory from the depth of Africa, and all of it passed through the harbour of Thonis-Heracleion. The spice merchants occupied their own quarter near the temple district, where the aromatic treasures they brought from distant lands would be sorted, weighed, and distributed according to ancient contracts that had been negotiated in the courtyards of the temple itself. Cinnamon from the forests of Ceylon, pepper from the mountains of India, cardamom from the western Ghats. These spices were not merely flavouring for food, but medicine, preservatives, and religious offerings that connected the daily life of every Egyptian to the vast network of trade that made civilization possible. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Thonis-Heracleion's commercial success was the system of weights and measures that governed all trade within the city. The priests of Amun were not only religious leaders, but also the guardians of commercial law, ensuring that every transaction was conducted according to standards that were recognized from the Pillars of Hercules to the shores of the Black Sea. The sacred cubit, the unit of measurement that had been established by the gods themselves, was maintained with religious precision in the temple's treasury, where master craftsmen would come to calibrate their measuring tools against the divine standard. The currency system of Thonis-Heracleion was equally sophisticated, accommodating the diverse monetary traditions of the many peoples who traded in the city. Egyptian grain measures were accepted alongside Phoenician silver weights, Greek coins, and Nubian gold dust. The money changers who operated from small booths near the harbour's entrance were skilled mathematicians who could calculate exchange rates in their heads and convert between dozens of different monetary systems without error. Their honesty was guaranteed by the priests, and any merchant who was cheated could appeal directly to the temple for justice. The wealth that flowed through Thonis-Heracleion was not hoarded, but reinvested in the city's infrastructure and defences. The harbour was constantly being expanded and improved, with new docks built to accommodate ever larger ships and new warehouses constructed to store the increasing volume of goods that passed through the port. The city's walls were reinforced with the finest stone and guarded by professional soldiers who were paid well enough to ensure their loyalty even in times of political upheaval. The lighthouse of Thonis-Heracleion, while not as famous as its sister beacon in Alexandria, was nonetheless a marvel of ancient engineering. Built on a natural rise in the harbour's centre, it stood nearly 100 metres tall and could be seen from a distance of 30 kilometres on a clear day. The light itself was maintained by a crew of skilled technicians who worked in shifts around the clock, ensuring that the beacon never failed. The fuel for the lighthouse came from the city's own olive groves, and the mirrors that focused the light were made from polished bronze that was replaced every few years to maintain maximum effectiveness. The merchants who made Thonis-Heracleion their home were among the wealthiest individuals in the ancient world, but they were also bound by traditions of civic responsibility that ensured the city's continued prosperity. The great merchant houses funded public works projects, supported the temples, and maintained private armies that supplemented the city's defences. When natural disasters struck, as they inevitably did in the delta's unstable environment, it was the merchants who provided the resources necessary for reconstruction and recovery. In the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Thonis-Heracleion, where the languages of a dozen civilizations mingled in the morning air above the harbour, cultural exchange was not merely inevitable, but essential to the city's very existence. The narrow streets that led from the docks to the temple district were lined with workshops where Egyptian craftsmen worked alongside Greek artisans, Phoenician metal workers, and Nubian jewellers, creating objects of beauty and utility that incorporated the best traditions of all these ancient cultures. The Greek quarter of the city, established during the 7th century BCE when the pharaoh Psamtik I opened Egypt to foreign trade, had evolved into a sophisticated district that maintained its Hellenic character while adapting to the rhythms of Egyptian life. The agora, or marketplace, that formed the heart of this district was built according to Greek architectural principles, but decorated with Egyptian motifs that reflected the hybrid nature of the city's culture. Here, philosophers from Athens would debate with priests from Memphis, creating a synthesis of ideas that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. The Phoenicians, those master traders who'd established commercial networks from Spain to the Black Sea, brought their own unique contributions to the cultural mix of Thonis-Heracleion. Their quarter, located near the harbour's western edge, was famous for its skilled craftsmen who worked in metals, textiles, and the precious purple dye that was worth more than gold. The Phoenician temples dedicated to Melkart and Astarte stood alongside Egyptian shrines in a religious tolerance that was remarkable for its time. The process of cultural fusion was most evident in the city's art and architecture. The great houses of the merchant princes combined Egyptian monumentality with Greek proportions and Phoenician decorative sensibilities. The walls of these mansions were adorned with frescoes that depicted scenes from Egyptian mythology, executed in the naturalistic style of Greek painting. Gardens that followed the formal patterns of pharaonic design were planted with exotic flowers and trees brought from every corner of the Mediterranean by merchant ships. The religious life of Thonis-Heracleion reflected this cultural synthesis in ways that would have been impossible in any other city of the ancient world. The festival of Amun, the city's patron deity, incorporated elements from Greek, Phoenician, and Egyptian traditions, creating a celebration that was uniquely cosmopolitan. Greek hymns were sung in the temple of Amun, while Egyptian priests participated in the festivals of Heracles, creating a religious calendar that acknowledged the divine presence in all cultural traditions. The educational system that developed in Thonis-Heracleion was equally remarkable for its integration of diverse intellectual traditions. The temple schools, which had traditionally focused on Egyptian hieroglyphic writing and religious instruction, expanded their curricula to include Greek philosophy, Phoenician mathematics, and the astronomical knowledge that merchants from distant lands brought to the city. Students from across the Mediterranean came to study in these schools, learning not only the technical skills they would need for careers in trade and diplomacy, but also the cultural sensitivity that was essential for success in the cosmopolitan world of international commerce. The legal system of Thonis-Heracleion had to accommodate the diverse legal traditions of the many peoples who lived and worked in the city. Egyptian law, with its emphasis on ma'at or divine justice, provided the foundation for the city's legal system, but Greek concepts of citizenship and Phoenician commercial law were incorporated into a hybrid system that was remarkably effective for its time. Disputes between merchants of different nationalities were resolved by panels of judges that included representatives from all relevant cultural traditions, ensuring that justice was not only done but seen to be done according to the standards of all involved parties. The linguistic diversity of Thonis-Heracleion created a unique form of communication that historians would later call Harbour Greek, a pidgin language that incorporated vocabulary from Egyptian, Greek, Phoenician, and other languages spoken in the city. This practical lingua franca allowed merchants, sailors, and craftsmen from different cultures to communicate effectively, but it also influenced the development of written language in the city. Inscriptions found in the ruins of Thonis-Heracleion show a fascinating blend of hieroglyphic Greek and Phoenician writing systems, sometimes appearing together on the same stone. The cuisine of Thonis-Heracleion reflected the city's cosmopolitan character in delicious ways. The basic Egyptian diet of bread, beer, and vegetables was enriched by Greek olive oil, Phoenician wine, and spices from the distant reaches of the Indian Ocean. The wealthy merchant families employed cooks who were skilled in multiple culinary traditions, creating fusion dishes that were uniquely characteristic of the city. The harbour district was famous for its taverns and restaurants that served food from every culture represented in the city, making it possible for a traveller to sample the flavours of the entire ancient world without leaving the waterfront. Music and entertainment in Thonis-Heracleion similarly reflected the city's cultural diversity. The traditional Egyptian harp was joined by Greek lyres and Phoenician pipes in musical performances that created new forms of artistic expression. The city's festivals featured entertainment that combined Egyptian religious drama with Greek theatrical techniques and Phoenician storytelling traditions. These performances were not mere entertainment but important cultural events that reinforced the bonds between the different communities that made up the city's population. The influence of Thonis-Heracleion's cultural synthesis extended far beyond the city itself. Merchants who lived in the city carried its cosmopolitan values to their trading partners throughout the Mediterranean, spreading ideas about religious tolerance, cultural exchange, and commercial cooperation that would influence the development of civilization itself. The city became a model for how diverse cultures could live together in mutual prosperity, a lesson that would prove invaluable as the ancient world became increasingly interconnected through trade and conquest. Beneath the busy surface of Thonis-Heracleion's harbour, where merchant ships jostled for space at the crowded docks and fishermen cast their nets in the early morning light, lay secrets that would not be revealed for more than 1,000 years. The city's relationship with the water was more complex than even its inhabitants realized, built as it was on the shifting foundation of the Nile Delta, where the great river's annual floods had deposited centuries of fertile silt mixed with the restless tides of the Mediterranean Sea. The priests of Amun understood, perhaps better than anyone, the precarious nature of their city's foundation. In the deepest vaults of the temple, accessible only to the highest initiates, were kept the ancient records that chronicled the city's ongoing battle against the forces of nature. These papyrus scrolls, some dating back to the city's founding, recorded the earthquakes that had shaken the region, the floods that had threatened to overwhelm the harbour, and the gradual subsidence that required constant vigilance and engineering skill to counteract. The engineers of Thonis-Heracleion were among the most skilled in the ancient world, masters of hydraulic engineering who understood the complex relationship between river, sea and land that determined their city's fate. The great seawalls that protected the harbour were not simple barriers, but sophisticated structures that could flex with the tides and earthquakes without breaking. The foundations of these walls extended deep into the seafloor, anchored by massive stone blocks that had been quarried from the granite hills of Upper Egypt and transported down the Nile on barges specially designed for this purpose. The harbour itself was a marvel of ancient engineering, its channels deepened and maintained by teams of divers who worked in shifts to clear the silt that the Nile constantly deposited. These divers, many of them skilled pearl fishers from the Red Sea, could hold their breath for extraordinary periods and work at depths that would challenge modern equipment. They moved through the underwater landscape of the harbour like spirits of the deep, their bronze tools gleaming in the filtered sunlight as they cleared channels, repaired foundations and recovered objects that had been lost to the harbour's depths. The religious significance of water in Thonis-Heracleion extended beyond the practical necessities of harbour maintenance. The priests taught that the harbour was a sacred space where the waters of the Nile, blessed by the gods of Egypt, met the waters of the Mediterranean, home to Poseidon and the other deities of the sea. This mingling of sacred waters was believed to create a unique spiritual environment where prayers offered at the water's edge would be carried to both the Egyptian gods and the deities of distant lands. The ritual calendar of Thonis-Heracleion included special ceremonies designed to honour the water spirits and ensure the continued protection of the harbour. During the festival of Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, sacred barks carrying the city's most precious religious objects would be rowed out to the deepest part of the harbour, where offerings of gold, jewels and incense would be cast into the water. These ceremonies were not merely symbolic but practical acknowledgements of the city's dependence on the goodwill of the waters that sustained its prosperity. The merchants of Thonis-Heracleion developed their own traditions related to the harbour's spiritual significance. Before embarking on long trading voyages, ship captains would visit the temple of Amun to receive blessed amulets that would protect their vessels from the dangers of the deep. These amulets, many of them made from stones that had been blessed in the harbour's waters, were believed to carry the protective power of the city's patron deity to the far corners of the Mediterranean. The city's relationship with the sea was also reflected in its architecture and urban planning. The great buildings of Thonis-Heracleion were designed to harmonise with the natural rhythms of the harbour, their facades oriented to catch the morning light reflected from the water, and their foundations engineered to withstand the constant movement of the earth beneath them. The city's streets followed the contours of the ancient shoreline, creating an urban landscape that flowed like water itself, with broad avenues that led naturally to the harbour and narrow alleys that provided shelter from the strong winds that swept in from the Mediterranean. The libraries of Thonis-Heracleion contained some of the most advanced knowledge of marine science in the ancient world. The priests and scholars who worked in these institutions studied the tides, the currents, and the seasonal patterns of the Mediterranean with the same intensity that their colleagues in other cities studied the stars. Their observations were recorded in detailed charts that were consulted by navigators throughout the ancient world, making Thonis-Heracleion not only a centre of commerce, but also a crucial source of the knowledge that made long-distance sea travel possible. The harbour's depths held treasures that went beyond the material wealth of lost cargoes and sunken ships. The priests spoke of underwater gardens where sacred lotus flowers bloomed in the brackish water, their roots extending deep into the silted floor of the harbour. These mystical gardens were said to be visible only to those who had been purified by the proper rituals, and they were believed to be the dwelling place of water spirits who watched over the city's prosperity. The seasonal rhythms of the harbour created a natural calendar that governed the life of the city. During the flood season, when the Nile rose to its highest levels, the harbour would fill with muddy water that carried the fertile silt of Upper Egypt. This was the time for dredging and harbour maintenance, when the city's engineers would work frantically to clear channels and repair the damage caused by the flood's force. During the dry season, when the Nile retreated to its lowest levels, the harbour would become crystal clear, its depths revealing the ancient foundations of the city and the artifacts that had accumulated over centuries of continuous occupation. The children of Thonis-Heracleion grew up with an intimate knowledge of the harbour's moods and rhythms. They learned to swim in its waters, to read the signs that predicted changes in the weather, and to understand the complex relationship between the city and the sea that sustained it. Many of them would eventually become sailors, merchants, or priests, carrying with them the deep understanding of the maritime world that made Thonis-Heracleion the greatest port of the ancient world. As the sun set over the harbour each evening, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson, the people of Thonis-Heracleion would gather on the waterfront to watch the ancient ritual of the day's end. The fishing boats would return from their work, their nets full of the silver treasure that the sea provided daily. The merchant ships would secure their moorings for the night, their crews gathering in the taverns and temples to give thanks for safe passage and successful trade. And in the deepest part of the harbour, where the waters were darkest and most mysterious, the spirits of the deep would continue their eternal watch over the city that had learned to live in harmony with the sea. The priests who tended the eternal flame in the temple of Amun noticed it first, a subtle shift in the sacred waters that surrounded their sanctuary. The tide pools that had remained constant for generations began to deepen imperceptibly, and the morning mist that rose from the canals carried a different quality, heavier and more persistent than the gentle vapours they had known for countless dawns. In the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, when the 3rd century before the Common Era was still young, the seeds of transformation were already taking root beneath the limestone foundations of Thonis-Heracleion. The great king in Alexandria had turned his gaze toward the Mediterranean, where Greek culture was spreading like morning light across the ancient world, and the old ways of Egypt found themselves challenged by new philosophies and foreign customs. The port city that had once served as the exclusive gateway to Egypt now faced competition from Alexandria, the gleaming metropolis that bore the conqueror's name. Ships that had once anchored in the sacred harbour of Thonis-Heracleion increasingly chose the deeper waters and broader quays of the newer city, where Greek merchants spoke in familiar tongues and where the bureaucracy moved with the efficiency of Hellenistic administration. Yet Thonis-Heracleion did not surrender its significance easily. The city had survived the conquest of Alexander, had adapted to the rule of his successors, and had maintained its sacred character even as political power shifted northward. The priests continued their ancient rituals, the customs officers still collected their dues, and the great festivals still drew pilgrims from across the Mediterranean world. But change whispered through the streets like wind through papyrus reeds. The younger generation of merchants spoke Greek as readily as they spoke Egyptian, and their children learned to read the angular letters of the new script alongside the sacred hieroglyphs of their ancestors. The old families who had controlled trade for generations found themselves sharing power with newcomers who brought different customs and different gods. In the harbour, the mix of vessels told the story of a changing world. Alongside the traditional Egyptian barges with their distinctive triangular sails, sleek Greek galleys now moored at the limestone quays. Phoenician merchants from Tyre and Sidon brought their purple-dyed fabrics and their skilled artisans, while traders from the emerging Roman Republic arrived with bronze weapons and pottery that spoke of a Western power growing in strength and ambition. The scribes who maintained the city's records noted these changes with the methodical precision of their profession. Trade revenues remained substantial, but the proportions had shifted. Where once the city had controlled nearly all maritime commerce entering Egypt, now it commanded perhaps half, with the remainder flowing through Alexandria and the other ports that had sprung up along the coast. The high priest of Heracleion, an elderly man named Kaemwaset, who had served the god for more than 4 decades, watched these transformations with the philosophical acceptance of one who had witnessed the rise and fall of many earthly powers. He understood that the sacred nature of his city transcended political arrangements, that the god would endure even as dynasties changed and new rulers claimed dominion over the ancient land. In the temple of Amun, the rituals continued unchanged. Each morning the priest performed the awakening ceremony, opening the sanctuary doors to greet the god with incense and song. The eternal flame burned with the same steady radiance it had maintained for centuries, fed by the sacred oils that merchants brought from the southern regions of Nubia and the eastern deserts. The seasonal festivals remained magnificent spectacles that drew visitors from across the known world. The festival of Khoiak, celebrating the death and resurrection of Osiris, still transformed the city into a theatre of sacred drama. Processions wound through the streets, carrying the sacred bark of the god from temple to temple, while thousands of pilgrims filled the squares and lined the canals to witness the ancient mysteries. Yet even in these sacred observances, the influence of change could be felt. Greek visitors, initially puzzled by the elaborate rituals and strange gods, began to find connections between the Egyptian deities and their own divine pantheon. They saw in Amun echoes of their own Heracles, in Isis aspects of their Demeter, in Osiris parallels to their dying and rising gods. This syncretism, the blending of different religious traditions, became one of the defining characteristics of Thonis-Heracleion's later period. The city that had once been fiercely protective of its Egyptian identity now embraced a cosmopolitan spirituality that welcomed diverse forms of divine worship. Greek merchants built shrines to their ancestral gods alongside Egyptian temples, while Egyptian priests learned to interpret their ancient wisdom in terms that foreigners could understand. The great library that had been established in the city's scholarly quarter became a centre of this cultural fusion. Scribes worked to translate Egyptian texts into Greek, while Greek scholars studied the hieroglyphic tradition with the dedication of devoted pupils. Mathematical treatises, medical texts, and philosophical works crossed linguistic boundaries, creating a rich intellectual environment that rivaled the more famous Library of Alexandria. Among the most significant developments of this period was the evolution of the city's religious architecture. The temples, while maintaining their traditional Egyptian forms, began to incorporate elements of Greek design. Columns carved in the classical orders appeared alongside traditional Egyptian pillars, while Greek geometric patterns adorned walls that also bore hieroglyphic inscriptions. The Palace of the Sacred Bark, where the god's ceremonial vessel was housed between festivals, received particular attention during this period. Ptolemy II himself contributed to its renovation, adding a magnificent columned hall that combined Egyptian grandeur with Greek elegance. The hall's ceiling was painted with astronomical scenes that reflected both traditions, Egyptian constellations sharing the heavens with Greek zodiacal signs. In the residential quarters, the architecture of daily life also reflected these cultural currents. The traditional Egyptian courtyard houses, with their flat roofs and inward-facing designs, were joined by Greek-style dwellings that featured peristyles and gardens in the Hellenistic manner. The wealthy merchants who could afford such luxuries often maintained homes that reflected both traditions, with Egyptian shrines in one wing and Greek symposium halls in another. The city's educational system adapted to serve this multicultural population. The temple schools continued to teach Egyptian writing and religious knowledge, but they now also offered instruction in Greek literature and philosophy. Young men from prominent families might study Egyptian theology in the morning and Greek mathematics in the afternoon, preparing themselves for careers in an increasingly complex world. Women, too, found their roles evolving in this changing environment. Egyptian women had always enjoyed considerable legal and social freedom compared to their counterparts in other ancient societies, but the Greek influence brought new possibilities. Some learned to read Greek literature, while others became involved in the syncretic religious movements that blended Egyptian and Greek spiritual traditions. The famous priestess Amun, who served in the Temple of Isis during this period, became renowned for her ability to conduct religious ceremonies in both Egyptian and Greek, making the mysteries accessible to pilgrims from across the Mediterranean. Her bilingual hymns, fragments of which have been preserved in later texts, demonstrate the sophisticated cultural synthesis that characterized Thonis-Heracleion during its mature period. The first earthquake struck on a quiet afternoon in the early autumn, when the Nile was beginning its annual recession, and the air carried the first hints of the cooler season to come. The tremor lasted only a few moments, but it was strong enough to rattle the oil lamps in the temples and cause the water in the harbour to slosh against the stone quays with unusual violence. The priests trained in the observation of natural phenomena noted the event in their records with careful attention to detail. They recorded the time of day, the direction of the tremor, and the behavior of the sacred animals in the temple precincts. The ibises that nested in the temple of Thoth had cried out in distress, and the sacred cats had hidden themselves in the darker corners of the sanctuary. Old Khemoset, now in his 70th year, remembered his grandfather's stories of similar tremors from decades past. The earth beneath Egypt was not always stable, particularly in the delta region where the Nile's sediments met the harder rocks of the Mediterranean shore. The priests had long understood that their city existed in a place where different geological forces met and sometimes struggled against each other. But this tremor was different from the gentle settling that occasionally disturbed the delta region. It came from deeper in the earth, and it seemed to resonate with a power that suggested more significant changes were taking place beneath the limestone foundations of the city. In the weeks that followed, subtle signs of instability began to appear. The water level in some of the sacred wells fluctuated in ways that defied the usual seasonal patterns. The great canal that connected the harbour to the Nile developed a slight but noticeable curve, as if the earth beneath it had shifted position. Most troubling of all, the foundation stones of the temple of Amun showed hairline cracks that had not been there before. The master builders who maintained the city's monuments examined these developments with growing concern. The construction techniques that had created Thonis-Heracleion were ancient and proven, designed to withstand the normal settling and shifting that occurred in delta regions. But the patterns they observed suggested forces beyond the normal range of geological activity. The harbour, which had been carefully engineered to maintain its depth and accessibility, began to show signs of change. The channels that had been dredged to allow the passage of large vessels started to shift, as if the underwater topography was slowly rearranging itself. The lighthouse keepers reported that familiar landmarks on the horizon seemed to have shifted position, though they could not explain how such massive features could have moved. Trade continued, but the merchant captains who regularly visited the port began to notice differences in the harbour's behaviour. The tides, which had followed predictable patterns for generations, became more erratic. The sandbars that had remained in stable positions for decades began to migrate, creating new hazards for navigation and requiring constant adjustment of the harbour's approach routes. The second earthquake, when it came 6 months later, was more severe than the first. It struck before dawn, waking the entire population with its prolonged shaking. In the temples, sacred vessels fell from their stands, and several of the older structures suffered visible damage. The great colonnade that fronted the Temple of Heracleion lost 2 of its massive columns, which fell with a crash that echoed across the still harbour. More disturbing than the immediate damage was the earthquake's effect on the city's water supply. Several wells that had provided fresh water for generations suddenly became brackish, as if seawater had somehow infiltrated the underground aquifers. The sacred spring that fed the purification pools in the temple of Amun began to flow with a different quality, its water taking on a slightly salty taste that troubled the priests. The harbour itself showed dramatic changes after the second earthquake. The great stone quays that had been built to accommodate the largest vessels developed cracks that allowed water to seep through. More significantly, the water level in the harbour rose noticeably, flooding some of the lower storage areas and forcing the relocation of goods and equipment to higher ground. The city's engineers, working with the architectural knowledge that had been passed down through generations, attempted to address these problems with the traditional methods of their craft. They reinforced the cracked foundations with additional stones, built new drainage systems to handle the increased water levels, and redesigned the harbour works to accommodate the changing conditions. But these efforts, while temporarily effective, could not address the fundamental changes that were occurring beneath the city. The geological forces that had been set in motion were beyond human control, representing a long-term process that would transform the entire region over the coming centuries. The priests meanwhile interpreted these events through the lens of their religious understanding. They saw in the earthquakes and the changing waters signs of divine displeasure, indications that the gods required additional offerings and more elaborate ceremonies to restore the cosmic balance. The temples increased their ritual activities, and the city's resources were increasingly devoted to religious observances designed to appease the supernatural forces that seemed to be threatening their home. The festival of Koyak in the year following the second earthquake became the most elaborate in the city's recorded history. The entire population participated in processions that lasted for days, carrying offerings to every shrine and temple in the city. The sacred bark of Amun was adorned with gold and precious stones donated by the merchant families, while the priests performed rituals that had not been seen for generations. Yet even as these religious observances reached new heights of magnificence, the physical signs of instability continued to multiply. The great canal that connected the city to the Nile required constant maintenance as its banks shifted and settled. The lighthouse, which had guided ships safely to port for centuries, developed a slight but noticeable lean that required the installation of additional supports. The third earthquake, occurring almost exactly a year after the second, marked a turning point in the city's history. This tremor was not only more powerful than its predecessors, but also lasted longer, with aftershocks that continued for days. The damage was severe enough that several of the city's ancient monuments suffered irreparable harm. The sacred lake, which had been the spiritual heart of the city since its founding, cracked along its eastern shore, allowing its carefully maintained waters to drain into the surrounding soil. The great statue of Amun, which had stood in the temple's central courtyard for over 1,000 years, toppled from its pedestal and shattered into pieces that could not be reassembled. More ominously, the earthquake opened cracks in the sea floor beneath the harbour, allowing seawater to penetrate deeper into the underground spaces beneath the city. The effects were not immediately apparent, but the slow infiltration of salt water into the foundations would prove to be one of the most destructive consequences of the seismic activity. The city's leadership, both religious and secular, met in emergency session to discuss the crisis. The high priest, now weakened by age and stress, argued for a massive program of temple construction and ritual observance designed to restore divine favor. The harbour master, representing the commercial interests, advocated for immediate engineering solutions to preserve the port's viability. The governor, appointed by the Ptolemaic administration in Alexandria, found himself caught between these competing priorities while also dealing with pressure from the royal court to maintain the city's contribution to the kingdom's revenues. The economic importance of Thonis-Heracleion remained significant, but the costs of maintaining the infrastructure were increasing dramatically. A compromise was reached that committed the city to both religious and practical responses to the crisis. The temples would receive additional funding for expanded ritual activities, while the harbour works would be redesigned to accommodate the changing conditions. The city's stonemasons and engineers would work alongside the priest to create solutions that addressed both the physical and spiritual dimensions of the problem. The reconstruction efforts that followed the third earthquake represented one of the most ambitious building projects in the city's history. Skilled craftsmen were brought from across Egypt and the Mediterranean to work on the restoration of damaged monuments and the construction of new defences against future seismic activity. The master mason Amenhotep stood ankle-deep in brackish water, studying the foundations of the great temple with the focused attention of a physician, examining a patient whose illness had progressed beyond easy remedy. The limestone blocks that had supported the magnificent structure for centuries now showed signs of erosion that spoke of a process more insidious than mere weathering. The salt water that had begun to infiltrate the underground spaces beneath the city was proving to be a more formidable enemy than the earthquakes themselves. While the tremors had caused dramatic but localized damage, the slow chemical action of dissolved salt was attacking the very substance of the city's foundations, gradually weakening the bonds that held the massive structures together. Amenhotep had inherited his position from his father, who had learned the craft from his grandfather, creating a chain of knowledge that stretched back through the generations to the original builders of Thonis-Heracleion. But none of his ancestors had faced a challenge like this one. The traditional methods of construction, designed for the stable conditions of the river delta, were inadequate for a city that was gradually sinking into the sea. The engineering problems were compounded by the changing nature of the ground itself. The sediments that had provided a solid foundation for the city's monuments were becoming saturated with seawater, causing them to become soft and unstable. Buildings that had stood firmly for centuries began to settle unevenly, creating cracks and distortions that threatened their structural integrity. The harbour, which had been the source of the city's prosperity, was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The stone quays that had been built to withstand the normal forces of wind and tide were being undermined by the changing conditions beneath the water. The great breakwater that protected the harbour from storms developed gaps that allowed waves to enter the previously calm waters. The city's water supply, which had always been abundant and pure, became increasingly compromised as salt water contaminated the wells and springs that had served the population for generations. The residents were forced to rely increasingly on water brought from distant sources, adding to the cost and complexity of daily life. The priests, who had initially interpreted the earthquakes as signs of divine displeasure, began to develop a more nuanced understanding of the crisis facing their city. The temple archives contained records of similar events from ancient times, and the scholarly priests who studied these texts realized that they were witnessing a natural process that had occurred before in the Delta region. The sacred writings spoke of cities that had been swallowed by the waters, of temples that had vanished beneath the waves, of gods who had departed their earthly homes to seek new dwellings among the stars. These accounts, which had been preserved as religious literature, now took on a new significance as practical guides to understanding the challenges facing Thonis-Heracleion. The high priest Kaemwaset, now in his final years of service, spent long hours in the temple library, studying the ancient texts with the help of younger scholars who could still read the oldest forms of hieroglyphic writing. They discovered references to rituals designed to protect cities from the encroaching waters, to ceremonies that could supposedly strengthen the bonds between earth and sea. But even as they explored these ancient solutions, the practical problems of maintaining the city continued to mount. The cost of keeping the harbour navigable, of repairing the damaged temples, of providing fresh water to the population, began to exceed the resources available to the local administration. The city that had once been a major source of revenue for the Ptolemaic kingdom was becoming a financial burden. The younger generation of residents, those who had grown up during the period of instability, began to consider alternatives to remaining in the increasingly precarious city. Some families relocated to Alexandria, where opportunities in the growing metropolis offered compensation for the loss of their ancestral homes. Others moved inland, establishing new communities along the Nile, where the ground was more stable and the water remained fresh. The merchant community, which had been the backbone of the city's economy, faced particularly difficult decisions. The ancient trade routes that had made Thonis-Heracleion prosperous were shifting to accommodate the changing conditions of Mediterranean commerce. The newer ports, with their more modern facilities and more stable foundations, offered advantages that the traditional city could no longer match. Yet the city's religious significance remained powerful, and the great festivals continued to attract pilgrims from across the known world. The festival of Koyak, in particular, became even more elaborate as the community invested its remaining resources in maintaining the traditional observances. The processions that wound through the flooding streets took on an almost desperate quality, as if the participants hoped that their devotion might somehow arrest the forces that were destroying their home. The temple of Amun, despite the damage it had suffered, remained the spiritual centre of the city. The priests had managed to salvage many of the sacred objects from the ruins of the great statue, and these fragments were incorporated into new ritual configurations that honoured the god while adapting to the changed circumstances. The eternal flame, which had burned continuously for over a millennium, continued to cast its light over the troubled waters. The priests who tended it had developed new techniques for maintaining the flame despite the increased humidity and the occasional flooding of the lower levels of the temple. Their dedication to this sacred duty became a symbol of the city's determination to preserve its spiritual heritage despite the physical challenges it faced. The libraries and schools that had made Thonis-Heracleion a centre of learning worked frantically to preserve their accumulated knowledge. Scribes copied important texts onto new papyrus, while scholars compiled summaries of the city's history and religious traditions. Some of these works were sent to libraries in other cities, ensuring that the intellectual legacy of Thonis-Heracleion would survive even if the city itself did not. The cultural synthesis that had characterized the city's mature period reached its fullest expression during these difficult years. Egyptian and Greek traditions merged in new forms of artistic expression, as artists and writers drew upon both heritage streams to create works that reflected the complex identity of their cosmopolitan community. The poet Apollodorus, who had been born in the city to a Greek father and an Egyptian mother, composed verses that became widely known throughout the Mediterranean world. His work captured the poignant beauty of a city slowly surrendering to the sea, while also celebrating the cultural achievements that had flourished on its slowly sinking foundations. The gradual nature of the city's decline meant that life continued with a strange mixture of normalcy and crisis. Children still played in the streets, though those streets were increasingly prone to flooding. Merchants still conducted business, though they had to adapt to the changing conditions of the harbour. Priests still performed their rituals, though they had to relocate some ceremonies to higher ground. The adaptation process was slow and often painful, but it also demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit. The residents of Thonis-Heracleion found ways to maintain their community bonds and their cultural traditions, even as the physical environment that had shaped their city for centuries continued to change around them. The last great building project undertaken in the city was the construction of a new seawall, designed to protect the most important temples and residential areas from the rising waters. The project required the cooperation of the entire community, as families contributed labour and resources to the common effort. The wall, built from massive blocks of granite, transported from quarries far up the Nile, represented both a practical response to the crisis and a symbolic statement of the city's determination to survive. But even as the seawall rose, the waters continued to encroach. The foundations of the city were settling deeper into the soft sediments, and the sea level itself appeared to be rising. The combination of these factors created a situation that no amount of human effort could ultimately prevent. The high priest Kaemoset died in his sleep on a night when the autumn storms were particularly severe, and his funeral became a city-wide observance that marked the end of an era. His successor, a younger man named Horus-Se-Aset, faced the challenge of maintaining the spiritual life of the community while also dealing with the practical problems of a city in decline. The new high priest brought a different perspective to the crisis. While respecting the traditional approaches that had sustained the city for generations, he also recognized the need for adaptation and change. Under his leadership, the temples began to develop new forms of worship that could be maintained even if the physical structures were lost. The concept of the eternal city took on new meaning as the priests and scholars worked to ensure that the spiritual essence of Thonis-Heracleion would survive even if its physical form was transformed. They developed portable shrines that could be moved to safety, created copies of the most important sacred texts, and established procedures for maintaining the religious traditions in new locations if necessary. The night of the Great Submersion began like any other evening in the life of Thonis-Heracleion. The sun set over the Mediterranean with the same golden radiance that had blessed the city for centuries, and the lighthouse keeper kindled the beacon that guided ships safely to port. In the temples, the priests performed their evening rituals, offering incense and prayers to the gods who had watched over their community through times of prosperity and adversity. But beneath the apparent tranquility, forces were stirring that would transform the city forever. The earth trembled with a different quality than the residents had experienced before. Not the sharp, violent shaking of the earlier earthquakes, but a slow, inexorable movement that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the Mediterranean sea floor. The harbour master, making his final rounds of the day, noticed that the water level in the port was rising more rapidly than the normal tidal patterns could account for. The stone quays that had been built to accommodate the largest vessels were beginning to disappear beneath the encroaching waters. The breakwater, which had protected the harbour for generations, was submerging so gradually that its disappearance was almost imperceptible. In the temple of Amun, the priest who maintained the eternal flame observed that the sacred fire was burning with an unusual intensity, as if the god himself were responding to the crisis that threatened his earthly dwelling. The flame, which had remained steady for over 1,000 years, flickered and danced in patterns that the priest had never seen before, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the fire that created them. The Great Submersion was not a single catastrophic event, but rather the culmination of a process that had been building for decades. The combination of seismic activity, rising sea levels, and the gradual settling of the city's foundations had created conditions that could no longer be sustained. The limestone bedrock on which Thonis-Heracleion had been built was slowly sinking into the soft sediments of the delta, carrying the city's monuments and structures down with it. The residents who'd remained in the city during its long decline faced the crisis with the stoic acceptance of people who had watched their world change gradually over many years. Some had already moved their most precious possessions to higher ground, while others had made arrangements to relocate to safer cities. But many chose to remain, whether from attachment to their ancestral homes or from a determination to witness the final chapter of their city's history. The process of submersion unfolded over several days, with the water level rising inexorably, despite all human efforts to hold it back. The great seawall that had been built to protect the city proved inadequate against the forces that were now at work. The massive granite blocks that had seemed so permanent began to shift and settle as the foundation beneath them gave way. The lower districts of the city were the first to succumb to the rising waters. The residential areas closest to the harbour, where the merchant families had built their homes and warehouses, gradually disappeared beneath the Mediterranean. The ancient streets that had echoed with the footsteps of traders and pilgrims for centuries became underwater passages that only fish would traverse. The temples, built on slightly higher ground, remained above water longer than the secular buildings. The great temple of Amun, with its massive stone construction and elevated position, continued to function even as the water lapped at its foundations. The priests maintained their rituals with increasing urgency, as if their devotion might somehow arrest the forces that were claiming their sacred spaces. The eternal flame, which had burned continuously for over a millennium, finally succumbed to the rising waters on the third day of the submersion. The priests had managed to keep it burning even as the lower levels of the temple flooded, but when the water reached the level of the sanctuary itself, the sacred fire was extinguished for the first time in recorded history. The moment of the flame's extinction was witnessed by the handful of priests who had remained at their posts until the very end. They described it later as a gentle fading rather than a dramatic quenching, as if the god himself had chosen to withdraw his presence from the earthly realm. The last high priest of Thonis-Heracleion, Horus Sa-Aset, gathered the remaining sacred objects and led the final procession from the temple as the waters rose around them. The lighthouse, which had guided ships to safety for centuries, was among the last structures to disappear. Its elevated position allowed it to remain visible even as the rest of the city vanished beneath the waves. The beacon continued to burn for several nights after the submersion, tended by a keeper who had refused to abandon his post. When the lighthouse finally succumbed to the waters, its light was extinguished forever, marking the end of an era in Mediterranean navigation. The submersion of Thonis-Heracleion was witnessed by several ship captains who'd been attempting to reach the harbour when the final phase of the disaster unfolded. Their accounts, preserved in the records of other Mediterranean ports, describe the surreal sight of a city slowly sinking into the sea, its buildings disappearing one by one beneath the waves until only the tops of the tallest structures remained visible. The last visible remnant of the city was the great statue of Heracleion that had stood in the central square, its head remaining above water for several days after the rest of the city had vanished. The statue seemed to stand guard over the submerged ruins, a final sentinel watching over the lost city. When it too finally disappeared, the transformation was complete. The site where Thonis-Heracleion had flourished for over 1,000 years became a bay of unusual depth, its waters mysteriously calm despite the storms that periodically swept the Mediterranean. The local fishermen who worked the area reported strange currents and unexpected depths, but few suspected that beneath the waves lay the remains of one of the ancient world's greatest cities. The survivors of the submersion, scattered across the Mediterranean world, carried with them the memory of their lost home and the cultural traditions that had flourished there. Some settled in Alexandria, where they established new communities that preserved elements of their heritage. Others travelled to distant lands, spreading the knowledge and customs of Thonis-Heracleion to places where they had never been known before. The religious artifacts that had been rescued from the temples were distributed among various sacred sites across Egypt and the Mediterranean. The sacred texts were copied and preserved in libraries from Athens to Rome, ensuring that the intellectual legacy of the city would survive even though its physical form had been lost. The priests who had served in the temples found new positions in other religious centres, carrying with them the ritual knowledge and ceremonial traditions that had been developed over centuries. The merchants who had conducted business in the great port established new trade networks that connected the cities where they had taken refuge. The skilled craftsmen who had created the beautiful objects for which Thonis-Heracleion was famous continued to practice their trades in new workshops, training apprentices who would carry forward the artistic traditions of the lost city. The cultural synthesis that had characterized the mature period of Thonis-Heracleion influenced the development of Hellenistic civilization throughout the Mediterranean world. The blending of Egyptian and Greek traditions that had occurred in the city became a model for cultural integration that was adopted in other cosmopolitan centers. The philosophical and religious ideas that had been developed in the city's schools and temples continued to influence thinkers and spiritual leaders for generations to come. The memory of Thonis-Heracleion was preserved in the works of ancient historians and geographers who recorded its history and described its cultural achievements. This city became a symbol of the impermanence of human achievement and the power of natural forces to transform the world. Poets and writers drew upon the story of the lost city to create works that explored themes of loss, transformation, and the enduring nature of human culture. The submersion of Thonis-Heracleion marked the end of an era in Egyptian history, but it also represented a beginning. The dispersal of the city's population and culture contributed to the cosmopolitan character of the Hellenistic world, helping to create the multicultural civilization that would dominate the Mediterranean for centuries to come. The city's legacy lived on in the hearts and minds of those who had called it home, and in the cultural traditions that continue to flourish in new forms and new locations. As the years passed and the memory of the living city faded, Thonis-Heracleion became a legend, a story told by old sailors and preserved in ancient texts. The site of the city became a mystery, its location forgotten as the coastline changed and new ports were established. The great city that had once been the gateway to Egypt became a name in ancient books, its physical reality hidden beneath the waves where it would remain undisturbed for over 2 millennia. The waters rose not with the fury of a storm, but with the patience of eternity itself. What had begun as subtle shifts in the harbour's depth became an inexorable tide that would claim not just buildings and streets, but the very memory of a civilization that had stood as gateway between worlds for over 1,000 years. In the final decades of Thonis-Heracleion's existence above the waves, the city's inhabitants had grown accustomed to the gradual changes. The great temple of Amun, once set back from the waterline by hundreds of meters, now found its foundation stones lapped by the Mediterranean waters during the highest tides. The merchants' quarter, where Greek and Egyptian traders had once haggled over precious goods from across the known world, had been slowly abandoned as building after building succumbed to the rising waters and the softening ground beneath. The priest of Khnum had been among the first to recognize the signs. Their sacred Nilometer, which had measured the life-giving floods of the Nile for centuries, began to register not just the river's annual rise and fall, but the steady infiltration of seawater into the very foundations of their sacred precinct. The brackish mixture that resulted spoke of a fundamental change in the relationship between land and water, between the eternal and the temporal. As the 7th century after Christ dawned, the last inhabitants of Thonis-Heracleion made their final preparations. Families that had lived in the same houses for generations carefully selected what they could carry. The massive stone statues of pharaohs and gods, too heavy to move, were left to stand as silent witnesses to whatever fate awaited them. The great harbour installations, the quays and warehouses that had made the city wealthy, were gradually abandoned to the encroaching waters. The final earthquake came not as a single catastrophic event, but as a series of tremors that continued over several months. Each tremor caused a little more of the city to slip, a little more of the carefully constructed drainage systems to fail, a little more of the sea to claim what had once been land. The process was so gradual that many of the city's inhabitants had time to relocate to Alexandria or Memphis, carrying with them stories and memories that would become legends in their new homes. When the sea finally claimed the last of Thonis-Heracleion's buildings, it did so with a gentleness that seemed almost merciful. The waters rose slowly, preserving rather than destroying, embracing the ancient stones with a protective embrace that would shield them from the harsh passage of time above. The great temple of Amun, its massive columns still standing, simply disappeared beneath the surface, its sacred fires extinguished by the same waters that had once carried pilgrims to its doors. For 13 centuries, Thonis-Heracleion slept beneath the waters of Abukir Bay. The city that had once been a bridge between civilizations became a secret held by the sea itself, its existence slowly fading from human memory as the world above continued its relentless march through time. The Mediterranean, which had taken the city so gently, became its guardian. The waters that covered the ruins were neither too deep nor too shallow, neither too warm nor too cold. They created a perfect environment for preservation, a liquid amber that held the city's remains in a state of suspended animation. The salt water, which might have been expected to corrode and destroy, instead formed a protective barrier against the kinds of decay that would have claimed a land-based site. In the depths, the city took on a new kind of life. Schools of fish made their homes in the spaces between fallen columns. Sea plants grew in the shadows of ancient doorways, their fronds swaying in the gentle currents like the temple banners that had once hung in the same spaces. The harbour that had once seen the arrival of ships from Cyprus and Greece now welcomed different kinds of visitors: dolphins and sea turtles, rays and countless species of fish that found shelter in the underwater ruins. The great statue of Hapi, the god of the Nile flood, lay toppled on its side, its massive form creating a reef that attracted marine life from across the eastern Mediterranean. The granite god, who had once blessed the annual flooding that brought fertility to Egypt, now provided a different kind of blessing, a home for the creatures of the sea. Around his prostrate form, coral began to grow, creating a living crown that transformed the ancient deity into something entirely new. The inscriptions on the statue's base, carved in hieroglyphs that proclaimed the god's eternal power, remained perfectly preserved beneath their coating of marine growth. The ancient Egyptian words, speaking of floods and fertility, of the eternal cycle of death and rebirth, took on new meaning in their underwater home. The floods they celebrated had indeed come, but not in the way their creators had intended. Throughout the submerged city, similar transformations were taking place. The Temple of Amun, its great hall now filled with seawater instead of incense smoke, became a cathedral for different kinds of worship. The columns that had once supported the ceiling now supported entire ecosystems. Each capital, carved, with lotus flowers and papyrus plants, became home to real plants of the sea, creating a garden that was both ancient and eternally new. The priest quarters, where generations of holy men had studied the mysteries of the divine, became mysteries themselves. The rooms where sacred texts had been copied and preserved now held only the gentle currents that carried sand and sediment through doorways that had once been guarded by massive wooden doors. The libraries, where the wisdom of ages had been stored, were now filled with the accumulated wisdom of the sea itself. In the merchants' quarter, the houses that had once sheltered families from across the ancient world stood empty but intact. The Mediterranean had filled their rooms with a different kind of life, the slow, patient life of the deep. In kitchens where meals had been prepared for Greek merchants and Egyptian priests, sea anemones now spread their tentacles, feeding on the microscopic life that drifted through the water. The great harbour, which had once been filled with the sounds of commerce and conversation, now knew only the muffled sounds of the underwater world, the cries of seabirds, the shouts of sailors, the creak of wooden ships. All were replaced by the gentle sound of water moving through stone passages, the soft whisper of sand settling in corners, the distant songs of whales passing through the deeper waters beyond the bay. Above the sleeping city, the surface of the Mediterranean showed no sign of the wonders below. Fishermen cast their nets in the same waters where ancient merchants had once docked their ships, unaware that they were sailing over a civilization that had once been the envy of the ancient world. The waves that lapped against the modern shoreline of Egypt carried no hint of the temples and palaces that lay beneath their surface. Time passed differently in the underwater city. The daily rhythm of sunrise and sunset, which had governed life in ancient Thonis-Heracleion, was replaced by the gentler rhythm of the tides. The seasonal changes that had brought the annual flood, the planting and harvest, the festivals and ceremonies, were replaced by the slower seasonal changes of the sea, the migration of fish, the flowering of sea plants, the gradual shift of currents that brought different kinds of nutrients to different parts of the bay. The city's clocks, if they could be called that, were now kept by the creatures of the sea. The daily vertical migrations of plankton and small fish created a rhythm as regular as any temple bell. The seasonal arrival of certain species of fish, the breeding cycles of the various marine animals that had made their homes in the ruins, the annual appearance of sea turtles who had learned to navigate by the ancient landmarks. All of these became the new timekeepers of Thonis-Heracleion. While Thonis-Heracleion slept beneath the waves, the world above continued its transformation. The Roman Empire, which had been the dominant power during the city's final centuries, crumbled and fell. The Byzantine Empire rose in its place, followed by the Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 CE. Each new civilization brought its own language, its own customs, its own understanding of the world. The memory of Thonis-Heracleion began to fade with each passing generation. The traders who had known the city's harbours died, and were replaced by new merchants who knew only Alexandria and the other ports that had risen to prominence after the great city's disappearance. The priests who had served in its temples took their knowledge with them to the grave, and the sacred texts that might have preserved the city's story were lost or destroyed in the various conquests and upheavals that swept through Egypt. In the great library of Alexandria, scholars might have found references to the city in ancient texts, but Alexandria itself was subject to the same forces of change and destruction that had claimed Thonis-Heracleion. The library's collection was gradually dispersed, its scrolls and codices scattered to the winds of war and religious upheaval. The careful records that Egyptian and Greek historians had kept of the city's importance were lost along with so much other knowledge from the ancient world. The Greek historian Herodotus, who had written about Thonis-Heracleion in his histories, was still read by scholars, but his references to the city began to seem increasingly mysterious. Without the physical evidence of the city itself, without the harbour installations and temple complexes that had once made its importance obvious, Herodotus's descriptions began to seem like the exaggerations of a storyteller rather than the observations of a careful historian. Medieval Arab historians, who had access to many texts that would later be lost, occasionally mentioned the city in their geographical works. They spoke of it as a place that had once existed, a port that had been important in the time of the Pharaohs, but even they seemed uncertain about its exact location or the reasons for its disappearance. The city became a legend, a half-remembered story told by old men who had heard it from their grandfathers. The Crusades brought European scholars back into contact with the ancient learning of Egypt and the Near East, but by then the knowledge of Thonis-Heracleion had been filtered through so many sources, translated and retranslated so many times, that it had become little more than a name in ancient texts. The city that had once been a crossroads of civilizations had become a footnote in the margins of history. During the Renaissance, when European scholars began to take a new interest in the ancient world, they found reference to Thonis-Heracleion in the works of classical authors, but these references seemed to point to a city that had simply vanished without a trace. Some scholars speculated that it might have been destroyed by earthquakes or war, while others suggested that it had never existed at all, that it was a confusion of names or a misreading of ancient texts. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 and the subsequent decipherment of hieroglyphics by Jean-François Champollion opened new possibilities for understanding Egypt's ancient past, but even these developments did not immediately shed light on the mystery of Thonis-Heracleion. The inscriptions that archaeologists began to read spoke of many ancient cities and sacred sites, but the great port city remained frustratingly elusive. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists working in Egypt made spectacular discoveries. The tomb of Tutankhamun, the temples of Abu Simbel, the ancient city of Akhetaten. All of these finds captured the public imagination and added to the growing understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization. But Thonis-Heracleion remained hidden, its very existence a matter of scholarly debate. Some Egyptologists argued that the city described by Herodotus was simply an ancient name for Alexandria, or perhaps for Memphis. Others suggested that it might have been located at one of the other known sites in the Nile Delta. The idea that an entire city might lie beneath the waters of the Mediterranean seemed too fantastic to be taken seriously, despite the clear evidence from ancient sources that such a city had once existed. The development of underwater archaeology in the mid-20th century opened new possibilities for exploration, but the Mediterranean off the coast of Egypt was not initially a priority for researchers. The waters were murky, the currents were unpredictable, and the political situation in the region made long-term archaeological projects difficult to organize. The sleeping city continued to wait beneath the waves, its silence unbroken after more than a millennium. Meanwhile, the Bay of Abukir, where Thonis-Heracleion lay hidden, had become known for entirely different reasons. It was here that Lord Nelson had defeated the French fleet in 1798, in the Battle of the Nile. The waters that covered the ancient city had witnessed one of the most decisive naval battles of the Napoleonic Wars, but the sailors who fought and died in those waters had no idea that they were floating above the remains of a civilization that had once connected the ancient world. Local fishermen, who had worked these waters for generations, sometimes brought up strange objects in their nets, pieces of carved stone, fragments of pottery, occasionally even small statues. These artifacts were curiosities, perhaps ancient but without context or meaning. They were often sold to tourists or collectors, their true significance unrecognized. The fishermen had no way of knowing that they were pulling up fragments of one of the most important cities of the ancient world. The city's silence was so complete that it had become absence itself. Maps of ancient Egypt showed the Nile Delta dotted with cities and towns, but where Thonis-Heracleion had once stood, there was now only blue water. The great port that had welcomed ships from across the ancient world had been erased from the surface of the earth as completely as if it had never existed. In the museums of Europe and America, visitors could see artifacts from Memphis and Thebes, from Alexandria and Aswan, but there were no galleries dedicated to Thonis-Heracleion. The city that had once been as important as any in Egypt had left no trace in the consciousness of the modern world. Its temples had no tourists, its harbours no ships, its streets no footsteps. The academic debates about the city's existence continued in scholarly journals and at conferences, but these discussions seemed increasingly abstract. Without physical evidence, without the kinds of dramatic discoveries that had made other ancient cities famous, Thonis-Heracleion remained a puzzle for specialists rather than a wonder for the world. Beneath the debates and the forgetting, beneath the changing currents of history and scholarship, Thonis-Heracleion continued its patient sleep. The city that had once pulsed with the life of 3 civilizations now knew only the gentle rhythms of the sea, These same waters that had taken the city also protected it, creating a time capsule that preserved not just buildings and artifacts, but entire ways of life. In the temple of Amun, the great statue of the god still stood in its sanctuary, its face turned toward what had once been the east, toward the rising sun that no longer reached its eyes. The god's expression, carved in granite by an artist whose name was lost to time, remained serene and eternal. The smile that had once welcomed pilgrims from across the ancient world now welcomed only the creatures of the deep. The offerings that had once been placed at the god's feet, bread and wine, flowers and incense, had long since dissolved into the sea. But new offerings had taken their place. Schools of fish swam in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic around the statue's base. Sea plants grew in arrangements that suggested the flower garlands that had once decorated the temple during festivals. The god's worship had not ended. It had simply changed form. In the residential quarters of the city, the houses that had once sheltered families from across the ancient world stood like silent witnesses to vanished lives. The bedroom where a Greek merchant had once slept beside his Egyptian wife was now home to a family of octopi, their 8 arms exploring the same spaces where human arms had once embraced. The kitchen where children had learned to cook the foods of 2 cultures was now a nursery for fish, their young finding safety in the stone corners where pots and pans had once been stored. The courtyard where the family had once gathered for meals was now a garden of a different kind. Sea anemones spread their tentacles where flowering plants had once bloomed. The fountain that had once provided fresh water for the household now provided a different kind of refreshment, a habitat for the smallest creatures of the sea, whose lives were as brief and precious as the flowers that had once bloomed in the same space. The workshop where the family's patriarch had once crafted jewellery for the temple priests and the wealthy merchants of the city had become a different kind of workshop. Here, the patient work of marine life continued the ancient tradition of creation. Shellfish built their homes with the same care that human hands had once taken in setting precious stones. The tools of the goldsmith had become perches for sea plants that grew in patterns as intricate as any human design. Throughout the submerged city, similar transformations had taken place. The bakery where bread had been made for the temple ceremonies was now a cave where fish came to spawn, their reproductive cycles as regular as the festivals that had once marked the religious calendar. The school where children had learned to read hieroglyphs and Greek letters was now a classroom of a different kind, where young fish learned the patterns of survival from their elders. The great harbour of Thonis-Heracleion had become a different kind of port. Instead of ships from Cyprus and Greece, it now welcomed the seasonal migrations of fish and sea turtles. The quays where merchants had once unloaded their precious cargoes were now resting places for rays and sharks. The warehouses where goods from across the ancient world had been stored were now caves where the treasures of the sea were kept safe. The lighthouse that had once guided ships safely into the harbour had become a different kind of beacon. Its stone structure, though long since toppled, still served as a landmark for the creatures of the sea. Fish used its fallen blocks to navigate the underwater landscape, just as ships had once used its light to find their way home. The customs house, where officials had once recorded the arrival of goods from across the ancient world, had become a record of a different kind. The layers of sediment that had accumulated in its rooms told the story of the sea's changing seasons, just as the papyrus scrolls had once told the stories of human commerce. In the deepest parts of the harbour, where the largest ships had once anchored, the water was still and dark. Here, the pressure was greatest, the currents gentlest. It was here that the most delicate artifacts had come to rest, The painted pottery that had once graced the tables of the wealthy, the jewellery that had once adorned the necks of priests and priestesses, the ceremonial objects that had once been used in the most sacred rituals. These treasures lay scattered across the harbour floor like fallen stars, their beauty hidden but not lost. The paint on the pottery had faded but not disappeared entirely. The gold in the jewellery had not tarnished, protected by the same waters that had claimed it. The ceremonial objects retained their sacred power, though the ceremonies for which they had been created were no longer remembered by any living soul. The city's greatest treasure, however, was not any single artifact or building, but the city itself, the complete preserved record of a way of life that had vanished from the earth. Here, beneath the waves, was a civilization frozen in time, waiting for the moment when it would be rediscovered and its stories could be told again. The waiting was not passive. The sea was constantly at work, sometimes covering the ruins with sand, sometimes uncovering them again. The currents shifted and changed, revealing new passages through the city, hiding others. The city was not static. It was in constant, subtle motion, like a sleeper who turns in the night but does not wake. Marine archaeologists, when they finally came, would find that the sea had been their greatest ally. The same waters that had taken the city had also preserved it in a way that no human effort could have matched. The salt water had prevented the kind of decay that would have claimed wooden structures on land. The steady temperature had slowed the chemical processes that would have broken down metals and stone. The constant moisture had kept organic materials from drying out and crumbling. Most importantly, the sea had protected the city from the human activities that had destroyed so many other ancient sites. There had been no looting, no reuse of stones for new construction, no gradual erosion of the site by farming or development. The city had been preserved in its entirety, a complete cross-section of ancient life that was unparalleled in the archaeological record. As the 20th century drew to a close, the technology finally existed to explore the underwater world with the precision and care that such a site deserved. Advanced diving equipment, underwater cameras, sophisticated mapping techniques. All of these were now available to researchers who had the vision to look beneath the waves for the treasures of the past. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the modern era. 13 centuries after its disappearance, Thonis-Heracleion was about to wake from its long sleep. The city that had been forgotten by the world above was about to remember itself, and in doing so to help the world remember what it had lost when the waters rose and the great port city slipped beneath the waves. But until that moment of awakening, the city continued its patient vigil beneath the Mediterranean. The temples kept their silent worship, the houses sheltered their marine inhabitants, the harbour welcomed its seasonal visitors. The great statue of Hapi continued to bless the waters that had claimed his city, his granite face turned toward a surface he could no longer see, his arms raised in eternal benediction over the sea that had become his temple. In the depths of Abukir Bay, where the currents were gentlest and the water was deepest, the heart of Thonis-Heracleion beat with the rhythm of the tides. The city that had once been a bridge between worlds had become a world unto itself, a realm where the past and present existed in perfect harmony, where the ancient and the eternal had found their final, perfect home. The silence was not empty but full of memory, full of possibility, full of the patient hope that someday, somehow, the stories that slept beneath the waves would find their way back to the surface, back to the world of air and light, back to the realm of human memory where they belonged. That day was coming, though the sleeping city could not know it. The 21st century would bring new technologies, new understanding, new possibilities for exploration. The same human curiosity that had once filled the city's harbours with ships from across the ancient world would soon turn its attention to the mystery of the lost city itself. But for now, in the eternal present of the deep, Thonis-Heracleion continued its dream, a dream in which the past had become the future, in which loss had become preservation, in which the ending had become a new beginning. The waters that had taken the city had also given it immortality, and in that immortality the city waited, patient as the sea itself, for the moment when it would rise again, not from the depths, but into the light of human understanding. The marine archaeologist's trained eye caught something extraordinary in the sediment patterns. What appeared to be natural formations on the sonar readings revealed themselves as the geometric precision of human construction. Stone blocks, perfectly carved and fitted, emerged from their sandy shroud like sleeping giants, awakening to the touch of modern technology. Each artifact that surfaced from the depths carried with it a story spanning millennia. Golden jewellery, its surface barely tarnished by centuries beneath the waves, spoke of wealthy merchants who once walked cobblestone streets that now lay 40 feet below. Bronze mirrors, their reflective surfaces dulled but intact, had once shown the faces of priests and priestesses who served in temples now home only to curious fish and swaying seaweed. The discovery of coins proved particularly revelatory. Stamped with the faces of Ptolemaic rulers and inscribed with Greek text, they confirmed what ancient historians had written, but what the modern world had begun to doubt. Here was tangible proof that Thonis-Heracleion had not been merely a figment of classical imagination, but a real place where real people had lived, worked, and worshipped. Among the most significant finds were the temple foundations themselves. The sacred precinct of Amun, once the spiritual heart of the city, revealed its secrets grain by grain. Massive stone blocks, some weighing several tons, had been arranged with mathematical precision to create a complex that would have rivaled any temple in Memphis or Thebes. The discovery of votive offerings, small bronze figurines, ceramic vessels, and inscribed tablets painted a picture of continuous religious activity spanning centuries. The hieroglyphic inscriptions found throughout the site became windows into daily life in ancient Thonis-Heracleion. Stone stelae, their surfaces covered with carefully carved symbols, told stories of religious festivals, royal decrees, and commercial transactions. One particularly significant find was a trilingual decree, similar to the famous Rosetta Stone, bearing the same text in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek scripts. This decree, dating to the reign of Ptolemy III, established the religious protocols for the annual festival of Amun. It detailed the procession route through the city, the offerings to be made at each shrine, and the responsibilities of various priestly orders. Reading these ancient words carved in stone over 2 millennia ago, archaeologists could almost hear the chanting of priests and the rhythmic beat of ceremonial drums echoing through the underwater silence. Other inscriptions revealed the multicultural nature of the city's population. Greek merchants had left their marks on warehouse walls, recording shipments of grain, wine, and luxury goods. Egyptian craftsmen had signed their works with proud hieroglyphic signatures. Even traces of Phoenician and Aramaic script appeared on pottery shards, evidence of the far-reaching trade networks that had made Thonis-Heracleion a cosmopolitan centre of the ancient world. The excavation of the harbour area yielded perhaps the most poignant discoveries. Anchors of various sizes and designs told the story of countless ships that had found safe harbour here. Lead anchor stocks bore the names of vessels and their home ports: Alexandria, Rhodes, Carthage, and dozens of other cities around the Mediterranean. Each anchor represented a journey, a cargo, a crew that had trusted their lives to the protection of Thonis-Heracleion's sheltered waters. Wooden ship timbers, preserved in the anaerobic conditions of the seabed, revealed the sophisticated shipbuilding techniques of the ancient world. The remains of at least 70 vessels were identified, ranging from small fishing boats to massive grain carriers. Some ships appeared to have been deliberately sunk, perhaps as part of harbour defences or to create artificial reefs. Others showed signs of having been caught in sudden storms, their crews unable to escape the harbour before the city's final submersion. The personal artefacts discovered in the ruins told intimate stories of the people who had called Thonis-Heracleion home. Gold jewellery, its craftsmanship rivaling the finest examples from Alexandria, spoke of wealthy families who had prospered from the city's trade connections. Delicate earrings, intricate bracelets, and ornate rings bore witness to the refined tastes of the urban elite. But it was the everyday objects that perhaps painted the most vivid picture of life in the ancient city. Ceramic oil lamps, their wicks long since dissolved, had once illuminated evening gatherings in private homes. Cooking pots, their surfaces blackened by countless meals, spoke of families gathering around hearth fires. Children's toys, small clay figurines, bronze tops, and gaming pieces reminded excavators that this lost city had once echoed with the laughter of young voices. Religious artifacts formed a particularly rich category of finds. Bronze incense burners, their surfaces decorated with scenes of gods and goddesses, had once filled temple courtyards with fragrant smoke. Limestone offering tables, worn smooth by centuries of use, bore the traces of countless sacrifices. Votive figurines depicting everything from sacred animals to worshippers in prayer created a pantheon of devotion frozen in bronze and stone. The discovery of a priest's ceremonial equipment provided unprecedented insights into ancient Egyptian religious practices. A complete set of ritual implements, including ceremonial knives, offering bowls and libation vessels, had been carefully stored in a stone chamber, perhaps in anticipation of the city's final abandonment. These objects, their surfaces still bearing traces of the sacred oils and incense once used in temple ceremonies, seemed to wait patiently for priests who would never return. Among the most spectacular discoveries were the massive stone sculptures that had once adorned the city's temples and public spaces. Colossal statues of pharaohs, their faces bearing the serene expressions of divine kingship, lay scattered across the seafloor like fallen titans. A particularly impressive find was a statue of Pharaoh Hathor, standing over 15 feet tall, its red granite surface polished to mirror smoothness despite centuries underwater. One of the most significant discoveries was a sacred bark, a ceremonial boat that had once carried the statue of Amun during religious festivals. This vessel, carved from a single block of limestone and decorated with hieroglyphic texts, represented the very essence of Thonis-Heracleion's religious significance. The bark's discovery confirmed ancient accounts of the elaborate river processions that had been central to the city's spiritual life. The bark's decorations told the story of creation itself, with scenes depicting the journey of the sun god through the underworld and his daily rebirth at dawn. Hieroglyphic inscriptions along the vessel's sides recorded the names of the priests who had served as its guardians, their titles and lineages stretching back through generations of religious service. Accompanying the bark were numerous other religious artifacts that would have been used in the festival processions. Bronze standards, their tops shaped like sacred animals, had once been carried by priests through the city's streets. Ceremonial oars, their blades decorated with scenes of gods and goddesses, had been used to symbolically navigate the bark through the waters of the afterlife. The discovery of these processional artifacts allowed archaeologists to reconstruct the annual festival of Amun in unprecedented detail. The celebration had begun with the ceremonial awakening of the god statue in the inner sanctum of the temple. The statue would then be placed aboard the sacred bark, which would be carried by priests through the city's streets, accompanied by musicians, dancers, and crowds of worshippers. The procession would make its way to the canal system, where the bark would be placed aboard a larger vessel for the journey to the Nile. From there, it would travel upriver to Thebes, where it would participate in the grandeur festival before returning to Thonis-Heracleion. This annual journey, which could last for weeks, represented the renewal of cosmic order and the continuation of divine protection over Egypt. The excavation of the commercial district revealed the sophisticated economic system that had made Thonis-Heracleion one of the wealthiest cities of the ancient world. Warehouse complexes, their storage rooms still containing the remains of goods from across the Mediterranean, spoke of trade networks that spanned continents. Amphora handles, stamped with the marks of their producers, traced commercial relationships with wine regions from Spain to the Black Sea. The discovery of standardized weights and measures provided insights into the ancient world's approach to commerce. Bronze scales, their arms perfectly balanced despite centuries underwater, had once been used to weigh precious metals and spices. Stone weight sets, carefully calibrated and marked with hieroglyphic inscriptions, revealed the mathematical precision that had governed ancient trade. Evidence of the city's role as a tax collection point appeared in the form of customs seals and administrative documents. Clay tablets, their cuneiform script still legible after more than 2 millennia, recorded the duties paid on various goods. These documents revealed the bureaucratic complexity of ancient Egyptian administration and the central role that Thonis-Heracleion had played in the kingdom's economic system. The merchants' quarter also yielded evidence of the city's cosmopolitan character. Pottery styles from across the Mediterranean indicated regular contact with trading partners from Sicily to Cyprus. Decorative objects showing Greek, Phoenician, and Egyptian influences demonstrated the cultural exchange that had flourished in this international port. Among the most intriguing discoveries were the remains of workshops where luxury goods had been produced for export. Evidence of glass-making, metalworking, and textile production painted a picture of a city that had not merely been a passive recipient of trade goods, but an active producer of the luxury items that were prized throughout the ancient world. The discovery of what appeared to be a royal or administrative complex in the city's centre provided insights into the governance of Thonis-Heracleion. Massive stone foundations, their layout suggesting a series of interconnected buildings, had once supported structures that would have rivaled the palaces of Alexandria or Memphis. The complex included what appeared to be audience halls, administrative offices, and residential quarters. Elaborate floor mosaics, their tesserae still displaying intricate geometric patterns, spoke of the refined tastes of the city's elite. Wall paintings, though fragmentary, showed scenes of daily life, religious ceremonies, and royal audiences. The discovery of official seals and administrative documents within the complex confirmed its governmental function. These finds revealed the complex hierarchy of officials who'd administered the city, from customs collectors to religious authorities. The documents also provided evidence of the city's role in the broader administrative system of Ptolemaic Egypt. Personal artifacts from the palace complex painted a picture of luxurious court life. Gold jewellery, fine pottery, and imported luxury goods demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of the city's ruling class. Gaming boards, musical instruments, and decorative objects suggested a culture that valued leisure and artistic expression. The palace complex also contained evidence of the city's final days. Hasty repairs to walls and foundations suggested that the inhabitants had been aware of the growing instability of their city. Valuable objects buried in storage rooms indicated that some residents had attempted to protect their most precious possessions from the approaching catastrophe. The archaeological evidence painted a detailed picture of Thonis-Heracleion's final moments. Rather than a single catastrophic event, the city's destruction appeared to have been a gradual process that unfolded over several decades. Geological analysis of the sediment layers revealed a series of earthquakes, each one causing further subsidence and bringing the city closer to its inevitable fate. The evidence suggested that the final submersion had occurred during the winter months when storm surges from the Mediterranean would have been at their most powerful. The positioning of artifacts and the distribution of debris indicated that the city had been struck by a series of massive waves that had swept through the streets, carrying away everything in their path. Human remains, though rare, provided poignant evidence of the city's final hours. Skeletons found in defensive positions suggested that some residents had attempted to protect their homes and families from the encroaching waters. Other remains, discovered in what appeared to be organized burial sites, indicated that the city's priests had continued their religious duties even as their world collapsed around them. The preservation of organic materials in the underwater environment had created a unique archaeological record. Wooden beams, leather goods, and textile fragments provided insights into aspects of ancient life that were rarely preserved in terrestrial sites. These materials painted a picture of a sophisticated urban society that had been suddenly and permanently interrupted. The study of pollen samples from the sediment layers revealed changes in the local environment that had preceded the city's destruction. Evidence of deforestation, soil erosion, and agricultural intensification suggested that human activity had contributed to the geological instability that had ultimately doomed the city. The rediscovery of Thonis-Heracleion sent ripples through the archaeological community and captured the imagination of the world. Here was proof that the ancient sources had been accurate, that the legendary city described by Herodotus and Strabo had indeed existed. The find challenged assumptions about the accuracy of ancient historians and opened new avenues for understanding the ancient world. The artifacts from Thonis-Heracleion found their way to museums around the world, where they continue to educate and inspire new generations. The colossal statues, the sacred bark, and the countless everyday objects tell their stories to millions of visitors, bridging the gap between ancient and modern worlds. The scientific techniques developed for the excavation of Thonis-Heracleion have advanced the field of underwater archaeology significantly. The methods pioneered by Gaudio and his team have been applied to other submerged sites around the world, opening new chapters in our understanding of ancient civilizations. The city's story has resonated particularly strongly in modern Egypt, where it has become a symbol of the country's ancient glory and enduring connection to the Mediterranean world. the discovery has contributed to a renewed interest in Egypt's Ptolemaic period and the multicultural civilization that flourished during this era. For the local communities along the Egyptian coast, the discovery has brought both pride and opportunity. The site has become a destination for underwater tourism, bringing visitors from around the world to experience the wonder of the submerged city. This has created new economic opportunities while also raising awareness of the need to protect Egypt's underwater cultural heritage. The excavation of Thonis-Heracleion continues to this day, with each diving season bringing new discoveries and insights. The site is so vast and so rich in artifacts that archaeologists estimate it will take decades to fully explore. Each season's work reveals new aspects of the city's life, from the grandest temples to the humblest workshops. Recent discoveries have included evidence of earlier settlement phases, pushing the city's origins back even further into antiquity. These finds suggest that Thonis-Heracleion had been an important site long before the Ptolemaic period, possibly dating back to the early Pharaonic era. The ongoing research has also revealed the extent of the city's connections with other Mediterranean civilizations. Trade goods and cultural artifacts demonstrate that Thonis-Heracleion had been a crucial link in the network of commerce and cultural exchange that had bound the ancient world together. Advanced imaging techniques have allowed archaeologists to map the city's layout with unprecedented precision. These maps reveal a carefully planned urban environment, with distinct quarters for different activities and a sophisticated infrastructure that had supported a population of tens of thousands. The study of the city's environmental context has provided new insights into ancient climate and sea level changes. This research has implications far beyond archaeology, contributing to our understanding of how coastal civilizations have adapted to environmental change throughout history. As the years pass and the excavation continues, Thonis-Heracleion has taken on a significance that extends far beyond its archaeological importance. The city has become a metaphor for the impermanence of human achievement and the eternal power of the sea. Its story resonates with modern concerns about climate change and rising sea levels, serving as a reminder that even the mightiest civilizations are vulnerable to the forces of nature. The city's underwater preservation has created a unique form of immortality. While the ancient residents of Thonis-Heracleion could never have imagined that their city would survive intact beneath the waves, the very disaster that destroyed their world has ensured that their story would be told with unprecedented clarity 2 millennia later. The artifacts from the city speak across the centuries with remarkable eloquence. The golden jewellery still gleams with the pride of its ancient owners. The temple inscriptions still proclaim the glory of forgotten gods. The humble household objects still bear witness to the daily rhythms of family life. In their silent testimony, the people of Thonis-Heracleion achieve a form of resurrection, their voices heard once again in the modern world. The city's religious significance has also found new expression in the modern world. The sacred bark of Amun, once carried in procession through the streets of the living city, now rests in museum galleries where it continues to inspire awe and reverence. The god's journey through the underworld, depicted in the bark's decorations, has become a metaphor for the city's own passage through death to rebirth. Scholars continue to study the implications of the city's discovery for our understanding of ancient Egyptian religion, politics, and society. The multicultural nature of Thonis-Heracleion has provided new insights into the Ptolemaic period and the complex interactions between Greek and Egyptian civilizations. The city's story has also captured the imagination of artists, writers, and filmmakers who have found in its watery grave a powerful symbol of lost civilizations and the mysteries that lie hidden beneath the waves. From documentary films to historical novels, the story of Thonis-Heracleion continues to inspire new generations of storytellers. For the communities of marine archaeologists and underwater explorers, Thonis-Heracleion represents the pinnacle of their profession. The site has demonstrated the extraordinary potential of underwater archaeology to reveal aspects of the ancient world that would otherwise remain forever hidden. It has shown that the ocean floor is not merely a graveyard of lost civilizations, but a vast archive of human history waiting to be explored. The conservation challenges posed by the site have also advanced the field of underwater heritage protection. The development of new techniques for preserving and displaying underwater artifacts has benefited archaeological sites around the world. The ethical questions raised by the excavation have contributed to important discussions about the responsibilities of archaeologists and the rights of local communities. As research continues and new discoveries emerge, Thonis-Heracleion remains a living testament to the power of human curiosity and the enduring importance of the past. The city that once stood as a bridge between Egypt and the Mediterranean world now serves as a bridge between the ancient world and our own, reminding us that human civilization is both fragile and eternal, capable of both destruction and remarkable preservation. Now, as the final grains of sand settle back into their eternal dance around the ruins of Thonis-Heracleion, the story reaches its quiet conclusion. The city that once echoed with the calls of merchants, the chanting of priests, and the laughter of children has found its voice again in the whispered discoveries of modern archaeology. Each artifact that rises from the depths carries with it the weight of memory, the substance of dreams that refuse to dissolve. The Mediterranean waters that claim this ancient jewel have become its most faithful guardian. Where once destructive waves swept away the works of human hands, now gentle currents caress the stones with the tenderness of time itself. The sea that seemed to spell the end of Thonis-Heracleion has instead become the author of its immortality, preserving in its depths what the surface world had forgotten. In the blue-green twilight of the underwater world, the city rests in eternal serenity. Fish swim through temple doorways where priests once walked. Seaweed sways in rhythms that echo the long silent temple bells. The sacred bark that once carried the god through streets of celebration now navigates currents of memory, its journey transformed from ritual to myth to rediscovered truth. The colossal statues that once gazed out over bustling harbours now watch over schools of fish and passing divers. Their stone faces, worn smooth by centuries of tidal caresses, still bear the serene expression of divine kingship. They are no longer guardians of a living city, but sentinels of memory, standing watch over the dreams of a civilization that refused to die. Above, where the ancient city once stood proud beneath Egyptian skies, the Mediterranean continues its eternal dance. Waves that have no memory of the disaster they once brought now catch the light of the same sun that once blessed the temples of Amun. The horizon stretches unbroken, offering no hint of the wonders that lie beneath. But in the depths, where darkness holds no terror and silence speaks louder than words, Thonis-Heracleion continues its patient vigil. The city waits, not for resurrection, but for understanding. It waits for each new generation to discover that the past is not lost, but merely sleeping in the depths of time. And so the story ends as it began, with water and wonder, with the eternal mystery of what lies beneath the surface of things. The lost city of Thonis-Heracleion has taught us that nothing truly disappears, that the sea remembers what the land forgets, and that in the depths of our oceans lie the depths of our history, waiting patiently for the day when human curiosity will bring them back to light. In the end, perhaps this is the greatest treasure that Thonis-Heracleion has given us, the knowledge that every ending is also a beginning, that every loss contains within it the seed of rediscovery, and that the stories we tell about the past are really stories we tell about ourselves. The city sleeps on, cradled in the arms of the sea, dreaming dreams that span millennia and whispering secrets that only the waves can hear. The waters remember, the stones remember, and now, because of the courage of those who dared to dive into the depths of both ocean and time, we remember too. Thonis-Heracleion lives on, not as a lost city, but as a found truth, a recovered dream, an eternal reminder that the greatest discoveries often lie not in the heavens above, but in the depths below, where water and time conspire to preserve the most precious gift of all, the story of who we were and who we might yet become. Thank you for joining this journey through the depths of time to the lost city of Thonis-Heracleion. If these ancient waters have stirred something in your soul, if the whispers of the past have found their way to your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with fellow travelers of history, and subscribe to our channel. Let us continue to explore the depths of human story together, one ancient mystery at a time. Until our next journey into the eternal past, may you find peace in the knowledge that some things, once lost, can be found again, and some stories, once silenced, can speak across the ages.